Hello, romance lovers. Today's story is called I Was Forced to Become the Princess of a Strange World. If you enjoy our videos, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss out on more exciting stories. In her story, the main character, who has dark eyes and hair with a cute face, will face difficulties that she never dreamed of, because her new appearance will surprise her so much that she will touch herself in surprise. The thing is that she will be reborn in a completely different world with a new appearance, or rather in the form of an invincible lady in battle named Yun, who has not only a bright, strong character, but also unique, open, and luxurious outfits. However, she will not be able to live her life alone, because on her way she will meet many personalities, including the one who will dare not only to come closer to her, but also to take her to himself, saying that from this moment on she will be his wife. Having absolutely no magical powers in the new world, the lady is still not weak, because she is able to defeat all opponents with one blow and knock them out, proving that she should not be underestimated. She is not going to be an involuntary bird in a cage. Therefore, having a unique beauty with long hair and a proud posture that only complements her appearance, she will promise herself to find a weapon that will make her 100 times more invincible. A young lady who has strict principles and a desire to always win, not allowing anyone to even humiliate her, because the girl is capable of being not only a queen with a golden crown on her head, but also the owner of a magical red sword. There will be many people on her way who will try to not only ridicule her, but also insult her out of hatred, which even the maids will do in her direction. But even in a seemingly cute pink dress, Yun will fight back against everyone. Not only difficulties await her, but also intrigues among the highest aristocracy, because she will be the only one who will be offered the reign and the crown. And not just anyone will do it, but the heir to the throne himself, who always follows her like a shadow. But in her past life, the girl also had a strong character because she worked in law enforcement, and she remembers her last working day most clearly, because in the darkness, she was already preparing to deal with the criminal. On that dark night, the lady was near a house overgrown with greenery, but a bright light was shining from its windows, which told the girl that the one she was looking for was very close, if the noise made people wake up. However, as soon as she was distracted for even a moment and did not notice how the unknown person approached her from behind, she already felt the barrel of a pistol on the back of her head, which was about to fire, which is why she was stunned. She couldn't do or feel anything because the attacker had already taken her life, which is why Yun ended up in an unknown space with a bright sky, where she met the spirit of a cute blonde who apologized to her for being late for 10 years when the heroine was already 26. The protagonist realized that her real mother was standing in front of her, but it seemed too late to reach out to her, because the blonde's silhouette was already moving away from her, apologizing for not being able to see her grow up. She was so shocked that she woke up from her sleep with the same despair, stretching her hand to the ceiling and rising from the bed, already in a completely new body, but with the memory of the past. The puzzled lady first looked at her hand and was surprised to see long strands of hair on herself, although she remembered that she had cut her hair short before entering the police academy. But the place where she slept turned out to be no less strange than her new appearance, because she had never seen such a room and, moreover, did not remember how she got into the quiet and dark red room. Getting out of bed, she decided to go to the large mirror, and as soon as she looked at herself, the girl realized that she was seeing a completely different person in the reflection, but not herself. Also, looking at her new outfit, the excited lady remembered her clothes, because it was this one that she modeled in high school. But now she doesn't understand whether she is in a dream or whether she was killed during a mission. But her thoughts were interrupted by an unknown old man in a dark robe who began to come closer and tell her in a gentle voice that he had found her in the mountains, and if it weren't for him, she would have definitely been eaten by monsters there, so she should be grateful to him. Looking at Yun with dark eyes, crazy with lust, and a sly smile, the old man said that now she was only his woman, and now she was obliged to repay him for saving her, which is why he stretched out his hands to her. The man failed to scare Yun because the girl decided to punish him for his words with a good punch to the face, which caused her to immediately brace herself and prepare her fist, intending to use her experience as a police officer. A second later, the old man was already lying on the floor and could not get up, only screaming in pain and crawling away from the woman, while the protagonist herself looked at him and understood that she was facing another loser. Thinking that she needed to immediately find the people she knew in order to find out what had happened, the girl had already hurried to open the tall, large, dark doors, intending to look at the view from the room. Imagine her surprise when she saw not the high-rise buildings with the streets and pigeons she was accustomed to, but blue dragons flying in the air as she looked at them in surprise, repenting on the terrace. She looked at each little dragon with great surprise on her face, not understanding what could have happened to her and what kind of world she ended up in. And most importantly, whether she would be able to return back to her home and study at the police academy. Looking at the houses she saw under the tall building and the terrace, the lady realized that she seemed to have ended up in the Middle Ages, because the houses looked old, and there were only chapels and carriages near them. The girl touched her head in a daze, realizing that she was not sleeping. If she felt the wind, the warmth of nature and the stone surfaces on which she stood, very realistically. And also everything around seemed real. But even here, she was not allowed to be alone with the Soyo, because the same old man who had just woken up after the blow also came out onto the terrace with his magician, whom he ordered to grab the lady, which is why strange and golden threads were already flying towards her. Those same threads made her fall to the ground, while the magician also created a magic circle in front of him, thereby preventing the girl from moving. And when the old man in the robe shouted that he had not saved her so that she could lie in his bed and hit him in the face, he got angry and yelled at the protagonist, telling her that if she had incredible strength and character, he would sell her to the market and also see her death with his own eyes, because there she would fight until she lost her pulse. She didn't understand what the master meant until she herself found herself in a huge arena, where there were an incredible number of people who were screaming with joy, intending to see exciting slave fights. In the center of the arena, there was already a fighter of strong build named Lawrence, who had 5 wins without a single defeat, which is why all the spectators were betting on him and wanted to earn as much as possible. And looking at the fighter was a quiet and excited Yun, who was also introduced by the hosts, saying only that she was a cutie with bare legs, who actually came to this world in the body of a 16-year-old teenager. She stood and waited for the moment when the hosts would announce the start of the fight. And behind her, she heard laughter and insults from the spectators, who called her dirty words and said that she was destined to die at the hands of Lawrence. And as soon as the hosts announced that the fight had begun, a fighter named Lawrence ran at full speed towards the lovely lady, intending to knock her out with one blow, but the protagonist stood and didn't even shake. The bare-chested slave's first blow was oblique, because the girl easily dodged his fist, stepping aside and already allowing herself to make her first blow against the self-confident man. Everyone, including Lawrence himself, was incredibly surprised that the lady was not only able to grab his hand, but also pull him along with her so hard that the big guy could not stand, but was about to fall to the ground. The 16-year-old heroine, who was called a cutie and humiliated for her long legs, managed to lift her opponent into the air on the first try and slam him into the ground with incredible force, causing him to scream in pain. He was not going to give up so easily. All the spectators, including the protagonist's owner who was watching the fight and sincerely wished Yun death, began to scream in shock, asking why a fragile lady was able to knock out an experienced fighter and how this was possible without magic. The spectators were shouting for Lawrence to get up immediately because they had bet a lot of money on him, which the fighter did, once again getting on his feet in front of the protagonist in order to try to win. The lady understood that she had to get out of here no matter what, and so she was already coming up with a plan on how to get away from everyone, while her opponent was already swinging at her with such force that it seemed he would raze her to the ground. But the girl turned out to be so physically prepared that this time she was able to dodge. She jumped to the side like a grasshopper, which caused her opponent to hit not her, but the ground, breaking it with a loud crack. The heroine was truly surprised when she saw a crack in her chain, realizing that she could get rid of it if she put in more effort, while her opponent could not recover from the second powerful blow to the ground. Lawrence was getting up, but he obviously didn't have as much strength as he had at the beginning, because he kept his head down and couldn't concentrate while all the spectators were indignantly shouting at him to grab the girl by the hair and knock her out, otherwise they would lose all their money. And the girl decided to take advantage of this, grabbing the chain on her neck with her hands and tearing it apart with a clang and screams that she was tired of all this, and did not intend to endure such bullying and ridicule any longer. With eyes mad with anger, she decided to look at everyone and ask what human life meant to them, if they were willing to watch people fight to the death while the spectators were just having fun and placing bets. She decided to take out all her anger on Lawrence, so she attacked him with her fist and screamed that this was all over, and therefore she was going to make him lose in order to save herself from captivity. It was with these thoughts that the girl hurried to swing her fist at the enemy again, which meant that the battle would now end and clearly not in Lawrence's favor, who was unable to inflict even a small scratch on the lady. Her strength was enough for her to hit the man so hard that he skidded across the ground and crashed into a stone wall, which shook from the cracks and damage that appeared. And Lawrence himself understood that he would not be able to get up again. He found himself right under Yun's master, who became even more indignant, ordering the fighter to immediately stand up and avenge him, also humiliating him for being defeated with one blow by a girl with bare legs. However, the old man with gray hair was unable to even call the guards to him, because the protagonist was able to jump with the agility of a cat onto the stone slab right in front of his astonished face, while the spectators around him gasped in shock. The old man jumped up from his seat, looking at the lady in shock as she squatted in front of them and called him real trash who shouldn't be deciding other people's fates, much less telling people who they are and what to do. She wanted to say in response that she was a count and that she had no right to talk to him like that, but the gentleman was unable to speak out because Yun decided to hit him in the face with her boot in order to push off at the speed of a bullet and run past the shocked spectators. She easily managed to climb onto the arena arch, where it turned out to be very high and dangerous. But this did not frighten the girl with long hair, because her desire to be free exceeded her fear several times. She was just a small black silhouette at the top of the arena, when below she could see not only the road, but also the carriages passing by, and one of them even conveniently stopped right below her. The stunned spectators looked at her and did not understand what the heroine intended to do next if she could not jump from there without magic. But while the girl looked at everyone with anger, the old man was already preparing to stop her. Because here too, he ordered his subordinate to use his powers to stop the lady with spells. And from this, the man with the cape directed his hands at her, already creating a blue magical circle. The girl quickly realized that all her efforts could be wasted if she hesitated. So she looked at the blue carriage she had noticed earlier, realizing that she needed to jump on it. And at that moment, when the magician had already directed a beam of his blue restorative magic at the heroine, she jumped down, from which the enchanting light rushed into the sky and did not even touch her, while the girl was already preparing to fall into the carriage. She looked at the blue roof of the carriage, preparing to break through it with her feet, and also thinking about how to apologize to the owner of the transport no matter what. There was a loud cracking noise with which the girl damaged the carriage, disturbing the peace of one gentleman in it, but she did not even suspect who the one who would save her from slavery would actually be. The unfamiliar aristocrats in her were frightened, assuming that they were being attacked. But when the brunette squatted down and began to recover from the fall, someone answered in a serious voice that everything was fine, because they had nothing to defend themselves with. The black-haired master's servant was surprised to see a fighting girl in front of him and prepared to bear his sword in an emergency, while his master sat quietly in the shadows on a large chair and looked at the guest. His eyes were blue and bright, which was visible even in the shadows, and it was with them that he looked at the protagonist with such calmness on his face, as if he had known since the morning that a stranger would visit him in the carriage through the roof. And the heroine herself looked at him with a serious face, which did not even indicate that she was even a little tense, because she was constantly looking at the aristocrat and was preparing to get up. And while people were already gathering outside the carriage, including the count himself, who wanted to take the slave for himself and apologize to the master, the brunette threatened the blue-eyed man with a knife, holding it to his throat and ordering him to leave, because this was the only way out of the situation. The faithful servant intended to protect his master, preparing to stick out his sword at any moment, shouting that a stranger had no right to speak to an aristocrat like that and tell him what to do. But Yun quickly and loudly said that if even one of them moved, she would instantly take the life of this aristocrat and would not even regret it, thinking only about her freedom. However, when the heroine's sharp knife was near his neck, the man still remained calm, looking at the girl and ordering his servant named Kesher to do everything as the stranger said and not to resist. Only after this did Yun let go of the boy and stop threatening him with the knife, causing the aristocrat to close his eyes, adjusting his sleeves and asking the lady if she was afraid that he might also attack. To this, the lady replied, looking at the boy, that when a person is tense, even his muscles change reflexively, and therefore she understood that he did not intend to attack her if he continued to remain calm. But after that, she asked whether the gentleman knew that she would threaten him. The aristocrat raised his blue eyes to her and with slight surprise in his voice told the girl that it seemed she was not stupid. But in response, Yun asked again why he intended to help her and what he wanted from her. And to this, the brunette, with a calm character and obviously serious intentions, said that he needed not just a pawn that he could play with without losing, but a strong and intelligent figure, thanks to which he could achieve a lot. The lady was still in front of him as he sat in the chair, saying that if she still intended to leave, he would pretend that nothing had happened and would leave her completely alone. But when the guy said that she wasn't sure that Olidi would be able to last long among the slaves without having mana, he snapped his finger and made the chain on the main character's neck split and shine with magic, which surprised her, realizing that she was free of it. After that, the aristocracy, as if nothing had happened, gestured with his hand, telling the protagonist that he was sure that she was smart enough not to refuse his help, even if she had not left now. Although there was a possibility. The lady, with her thoughts, seemed to find herself in an empty space, telling the gentleman that she really had no choice, since the slave owners were already waiting for her outside, and here she at least needed to know who this nobleman was. And it was quite loud outside the carriage because when the servant opened the curtain, the aristocrat saw many people greeting him and calling him the crown prince, and also telling him to take that slave girl for himself if he liked her. Only after hearing from strangers that the man she threatened with a knife was a prince, the astonished heroine looked at him with doubt, not believing that in front of her sat not just an aristocrat, but practically the highest man among them. But what was even more surprising was that the prince stood up from his chair not only to hug the main character, but also to loudly tell everyone that from that moment on she was not a slave at all, but his wife. And while everyone was gasping and groaning in amazement and shock, Yun herself couldn't believe what was happening. And so she looked at the guy with stunned eyes while he continued to hug her with his hand and look at everyone with pride and firmness. Absolutely all the counts and commoners, slave owners, and ordinary passers-by who found themselves before the prince bowed to him when he said that from now on this lady was not a slave, and never had been and never would be one again. But she never said anything against it because she looked down and just remained silent when the guy behind her put his hand on her shoulder and said that he was glad that she understood the whole situation. Only after this did the crown prince's blue carriage begin to drive away from the surprised crowd of people, when everyone followed it with their eyes and were stunned by the outcome of events, when an ordinary but incredibly strong slave was taken by the prince personally. But the most active and angry of all was the count with a bald head and light hair, who looked at the carriage with incredible anger, called the heroine a real mouse who brazenly took advantage of the prince, and therefore he promised himself that he would not leave her alone. When it was completely dark outside and twinkling, beautiful stars were visible in the blue sky, the lady, together with the prince, arrived at the palace of the aristocrat, who had an individual flag on the roof of a light, beautiful building. But inside it there were a great many maids in hearing, just as from surprise, because they were all looking not only at the returned prince, but also at the one whom he had brought with him. The fact is that the crown prince did not hesitate to carry the girl in his arms and walk with her along the corridors in order to personally bring her to the room. But the protagonist was so surprised by this that she was afraid to even touch the young man with her hand. And while she did not understand why the prince was carrying her in his arms in front of everyone, the guy with her stopped, because in front of them were 3 maids who hurried to fulfill the aristocrat's order to immediately take care of the guest and wash her. Even when the lady was enjoying the hot water in the bath, she was constantly asked questions about how she met the prince, how she managed to win his attention, and whether he was attracted to her clothes, because the 2 maids next to her were interested in all this. While the girls were surprised at how romantically the prince carried the heroine in his arms to the palace, the protagonist herself sat in the bath and was silent, thinking about her experiences and thoughts. But the gossips' conversations were interrupted by a serious, dark-haired maid who ordered everyone to immediately stop their idle chatter and get down to business, because Mrs. Yun now needed silence and rest. After the girl was wrapped in a large white towel and washed, the protagonist told the maid that she only wanted to rest in her room. But the maid replied that unfortunately she would not be able to rest because the prince was waiting for her in his bedroom. Yun was quite surprised by this, but she knew that the prince was quite a serious man. So she decided to appear in front of his bedroom door already in a simple, light nightgown, when the maid was next to her and announced that the master was already in the bedroom. Before the main character hurried to enter the aristocrat's chambers, the dark-haired maid smiled goodbye, telling the guest in the palace to enter and not be afraid. But when the girl thought that she would definitely run away from here without intending to immediately enter the bedroom, she herself did not notice how she found herself next to the prince's large bed, where he was calmly reading a book and lying in a dark robe, because she herself was dragged by magical powers straight to the bed, on which she fell face down, while the aristocrat told her to enter him more boldly, as if he had known from the very beginning that she was standing there. Stunned by such an event, the lady raised her head and looked at the bed in surprise, thinking that she herself could walk, and therefore helping her with some kind of magic was an unnecessary action. Putting the book on his feet, the guy looked at the guest in his chambers as if indifferently, and said that she had made him wait, completely ignoring what the lady had told him before. In response, the heroine only folded her arms across her chest and sternly replied that she did not understand why he had called her at such an hour, because she was going to be his pawn, but not his lover. She also looked at the appearance of the prince in front of her, realizing that he was a rare, handsome man with rich eyes and black hair. But even with such an appearance, she would not have any closer dealings with him than a simple agreement. But the girl was surprised when the guy in the bed in front of her explained that he had no intention of doing anything else with her, but because he had brought her here only for safety, because only his room where he was could be completely safe for her. The brunette with long hair looked menacingly at the prince and asked what he wanted then, if he called her a pawn, and also assured her that he expected nothing more from her than simple cooperation. But the guy in front of her simply closed his eyes and replied that she should just go to the couch to sleep now and not disturb him, and she could ask her questions later, in a week, because they weren't that important. However, the protagonist was not going to tolerate such antics of the gentleman, so she decided to teach him a lesson by climbing into his bed as if she also intended to sleep there. And when the stunned prince crawled away from her, asking her if she was crazy, the heroine only answered that she wanted to sleep in the bed and not on the sofa. The lady, angry with the prince, asked him whether he had brought her in his arms in front of everyone in order to put on a demonstration show, as if this was what irritated her, and that was why she intended to teach him a lesson. Turning over on her side and settling herself more comfortably, she said that it would be more convincing to see her maids in his bed in the morning than on the sofa. But the astonished prince could not answer anything, but only looked. Angry at her, he began to look at her closely and ask how she could be so shameless and impudent if she was a woman. As soon as the heroine fell asleep, she immediately found herself in her home, being in Korea, where she studied at the police college and before that always got ready in a hurry, holding breakfast in her mouth and putting on her shoes with her hands. But when she realized that she still had not fulfilled her dream of becoming a police officer, she found herself in an unknown, black space from which she began to fall, because an unknown man pushed her off a skyscraper. It was at this moment that the lady woke up, jumping out of bed and shouting in reality that she did not want to die, although she found herself completely alone in a bright bedroom with a large bed. But the prince was no longer nearby. As soon as she woke up, there were many maids around her who were going to tidy her up and dress her, who were also talking about the prince, saying that he had finally left his past and loved her. But when Yoon washed herself with a white towel, she did not understand what they were talking about. They never answered Yoon's question about what past they were telling her about, because after a while the girl was already dressed in a cute pink dress with bows, which also decorated the heroine's hairstyle. The maids really liked the heroine's image and thought that with such a dress she would be the most beautiful of all women. But when they admired her from behind, Yoon herself was angry and ashamed of her appearance because she was not used to it. A dark-haired maid even came up to her and said that the crown prince personally chose this dress for her, and therefore she cannot dress differently than he personally wants, because she is his chosen one. Hearing this, the brunette with dark, deep eyes seriously thought about what taste she should dress according to if she was not going to become the prince's lover, but only to make some kind of deal with him. Remembering how the main character had invaded the prince's bed the previous night and slept there despite everything, she clenched her hands into fists in anger, realizing that the prince was probably taking revenge on her for sleeping in his bed. Also, the dark-haired maid with closed eyes and a slight smile said that immediately after breakfast, they were going to greet a certain Miss Eloise, which made the heroine surprised, not understanding who this woman was. However, the maid herself quickly told the new guest that Miss Eloise, who has purple, long hair and prefers dark, elegant dresses, is the prince's bride and the youngest daughter in the Tilcleo family, and because of her enormous power, everyone must give way to her. The protagonist stood and pondered the information, while two maids near her told her that the bride was a show-off, and the prince did not like her at all, because they were sure that he loved only her. And while the main character was learning even more information not only about the prince, but also about other aristocracy in the palace, Miss Eloise herself was at a snow-white table, on which she was brought a lot of sweets, including pieces of cake and cupcakes. But she did not want food, but the guest she was interested in. She sat at a table on the terrace and enjoyed the fresh air, but she was still impatient to see that very lady whom the prince had carried into the palace in his arms, and that was why she was indignant at the maid standing next to her, asking why she didn't come to her. With her violet eyes, she looked angrily at her personal maid and told her that it was a real outrage if a stranger did not respect her so much that she did not come to her to get acquainted. That's why she and the maid decided to get up from the table and walk down the corridor, wondering what the prince saw in that commoner, and also intending to come to her herself if Yun didn't please her with his arrival. The short-haired maid behind her calmly explained that since her name was very short and simple, she was most likely an ordinary commoner from Hongyan, an equally unremarkable village. But at that moment, when Eloise looked angrily at someone and stopped, she answered the maid that it did not matter to her whether she was a commoner or not, since for her personally she was a simple girl, not worthy of even being in this palace. In front of the embittered Eloise stood the main character and her personal maid with dark hair, who asked the prince's bride if she was criticizing the master's taste if she said that she did not like Yun, since the prince chose her personally. The protagonist looked at Eloise in front of her with calmness and fortitude, telling her that she was the same Yun that everyone was talking about. But it was the dress that Yun was wearing that attracted the attention of the prince's bride. A dark aura immediately formed around them because Eloise folded her hands in displeasure, saying that it seemed like Yun was really a commoner if she had just greeted her with her name, and it was forbidden to do that to the Duchess. But besides Eloise herself in a crimson dark dress, the maid also stood up for her, covering her mistress with her hand and asking Yun if she hadn't listened to the words of the Duchess and didn't understand what needed to be done now. She meant that as an apology to the Duchess, one should immediately bow. But Yun, realizing that he did not want to run into a conflict, curtsied to Eloise. But her dark-haired maid became agitated, wanting to say that there was no need to lower her status in front of the Duchess. However, that was not all, because when the prince's bride was laughing with Yun, her maid suddenly waved her hand towards the heroine in the pink dress, but the heroine was unable to dodge. And the short-haired maid, while Miss Eloise was looking at the situation with shock, said that she should apologize to her mistress not standing, but on her knees, which she ordered her to do right now. Yun herself was stunned because the maid hit her so hard on the cheek that her lips started bleeding, and she looked at the floor in shock because she didn't expect that. The maid Yun immediately approached the protagonist and began to ask her about her health, but the lady only remembered how she was beaten at school, while Eloise with purple eyes narcissistically said that according to the rules, commoners should always fall on their knees before nobles. And everyone was shocked by the fact that instead of following Eloise's orders, the main character looked at her with anger, fury, and madness, already preparing her fists and saying that she doesn't need to be taught anything, like a dog. And while the main character was already planning to teach the Duchess and her maid a lesson, in his office the prince listened to a report from a servant, saying that the origin of his guest was unknown, but there was information that she was from Hunyang, and also that Count Psycho had picked her up outside the capital. While reading all the available information from the paper, the servant looked at the prince and told him that there were no leads and that it was useless to look for them because there was practically no information about Yun. However, the servant was greatly surprised that the crown prince, who was sitting quietly on the table, ordered that his guest be given a surname immediately, which made the butler wonder if this was even permissible. The prince merely tilted his head to the side and told the servant to do as he ordered. The fragments passed as a wild cat that Yun had was no longer of interest to him, and now she would be a full-fledged noblewoman in his palace. But while the prince was sure that his guest was only getting used to the palace and getting to know the staff, trying on new dresses, the heroine was already grabbing the top of her head and adjusting the bow on her neck, looking menacingly at Eloise. The protagonist angrily promised the Duchess that she would now teach her how to speak properly with people. The purple-haired lady became agitated, asking how she dared to tell her such a thing, but her maid was already running to Garyon in order to teach her a lesson in return. She swung her hand at Yun again to punish her with another blow to the cheek, so she did it confidently. But she did not suspect that all her plans would be destroyed because of the heroine's anger. She never managed to hit the heroine because the lady in the pink dress quickly grabbed her wrist and did not let her hit herself, doing it so hard that the maid did not even manage to lower her hand back down. She looked at the short-haired maid with her black eye, and still holding her hand tightly, Yun convinced her that she would break her hand in 2 blows if she tried to hit her again. Having twisted the maid's arm and thereby causing her to fall to the floor, Yun continued to tell them that they were all equal here, and therefore there was no need to tell anyone or order them to do something, as she did. The Duchess and Yun's personal maid were shocked as they watched what was happening, and were even more surprised when the maid managed to break free and move away from Yun to try to take revenge on her once more. From under her sleeve, she quickly pulled out not only a pipe, but also a purple dart in it, which she shot straight towards Yun with her mouth, as if it were not just a dart, but a needle with a deadly composition. But no matter how evil and nimble the maid was, Yoon still managed to dodge her weapon, causing the purple object to fly past her and was about to crash into the white wall. Turning back, the lady with an angry look noticed that the unusual game, having crashed its sharp end into the wall, began to crack into small pieces and glow with a magical light brighter. The end result was that not only did the game evaporate, but it also left deep cracks in the wall that continued to appear even after the item disappeared, causing the protagonist to realize the danger of the maid's weapon. Seeing this, she was stunned, already wondering what it was and why the wall had cracked, and most importantly, whether the maid was going to kill her in this way. She had already taken a fighting stance right in front of her opponent and began to pester her with anger, asking why he intended to kill her if she had already warned her that she would break her arms for trying to harm her. But the maid was so angry with Aeyeon that she didn't take her words seriously. She only wanted to teach her a lesson, which is why she looked at her with fury and an incredible desire to hurt the girl. She decided to swing her hand at Yoon again, telling him that there was no need for a person who was about to die to know too much, referring to the protagonist and how she would take her life with one blow of her hand. But what was the surprise of all the girls when they saw how the body of the maid was pierced by a long and glowing, magical sword of extraordinary sharpness, because of which an unusually large amount of blood gushed from the lady's body. The maid and the protagonist of the story herself looked at what had happened with wide eyes, motionless, watching as new splashes of blood flew to the sides and smashed onto the floor. The Duchess Eloise, who was the mistress of this servant, was most surprised, because she looked at the imminent death of her charge with astonishment and an incredibly strong shock. Eloise screamed in horror as she watched the already dead maid lying on the floor, while mysterious golden rays of magic were clearly emanating from her body, which Yoon and her maid were watching. As it turned out, the killers of the evil maid were two guys, one of whom had a blue suit and with the help of one finger made his charms work. And behind him stood a blonde guy who smiled and said that the girl did not deserve to live. The second one slowly moved towards Yoon, who was stunned by his appearance, apologizing for making unnecessary noise in the corridor and scaring everyone. And he also laughed politely, as if nothing serious had actually happened. The young man not only has a luxurious outfit with a variety of patterns, but also a unique appearance, because his shining golden hair is complemented by the same clear blue eyes with which he looked at Yoon and smiled. He continued to laugh and smile even when he spoke about the dead maid, calling her a real rat who only frightened the heroine, and so he ordered his servant to immediately remove her from here. The servant hurried to carry out his master's order, which is why only a large, bloody mark remained on the light stone floor from the servant, looking at which, the Duchess was even more afraid that she could faint from shock. Noticing that Eliza was not feeling well, the servant hurried to take her to another room to rest. But she, frightened, decided to turn around, where she saw Yoon, who was following her with an empty and stern look, as if she had not seen anything terrible in front of her. Left alone with Yoon, the blonde decided to approach her and say with a smile that palace rat who doesn't know the mountains will no longer bother her, meaning that same murdered servant. He even knelt down to take a strand of Yoon's long hair in his hand and admired it, telling her that she was like a magical flower that needed to be protected from evil people like that maid. However, everything around seemed to turn black when Yoon, looking at the blonde, said that she still did not consider the maid a rat, but still thanked him for his care and help, which puzzled and surprised the aristocrat. But after he got back on his feet, he smiled and told Jarina that she was a really interesting person, and he also invited her to go with him wherever she wanted. Yoon refused the blonde's offer, saying that she didn't want any trouble, and she also helped her maid get up from the shock, telling the master that she was the prince's girl, and therefore wanted to be grateful only for his kindness, avoiding closer communication. The blonde had to only watch the two ladies with a curious look and a smile, realizing that his brother's taste in women had changed if he thought that Yoon would turn out to be another sweet lady, which turned out to be completely wrong. At this time, Yoon and his maid were walking around the Snow White Palace, and the maid said that she could not believe that Miss Eloise forced her maid to harm her. Turning away from the maid, the heroine said that despite the help of Risselt, that same blonde man, she would like to do without bloodshed, just to teach the maid a lesson, and the interlocutor next to her was surprised by such words. Looking ahead, the lady with long hair thought that it seemed that the suspicious Risselt did not want to help her at all, which is why she asked the maid if the heir to the throne had not yet been determined and how many children the king had in total. When the maid started talking about Risselt, the lady imagined him in her head, telling him that the king has a daughter who has no right to the throne due to poor health, and he also has a son, Risselt, elegant and charismatic. And the king's third child is the prince himself, with dark hair and blue eyes, who earlier carried the heroine to the palace in his arms and ordered everyone to treat her like an aristocrat. Realizing that she seemed to have entered a feudal world where not only men but also the highest aristocrats ruled everything, Lady Sivero ordered her maid to immediately take her to the third prince to finally talk to him. And so, after some time, a servant was already in the prince's office, who informed him of Yun's arrival. But the dissatisfied gentleman with a pen in his hand replied that he was busy, and the heroine should be ordered to get out of here. Hearing this, the servant's face darkened because he said that Yun personally told him that if he refused to receive her, she would burst into his office without warning. Because of this, the angry and dissatisfied prince raised his head to the servant and, out of suppressed rage, even broke the pen with which he had previously written documents. And all because of Yun, who had infuriated him with her disposition. A second later, the main character appeared in the prince's office, and he ordered her to say what she wanted faster and to the point because he was busy, which is why the lady calmly said that she just needed a weapon. While looking at the papers, the prince asked the girl why she needed a weapon if women usually entertained themselves with tea and desserts in the palace. But if she wanted it so much, he recommended that she ask the servants to take her through the royal gardens. But even after this, the girl did not leave, continuing to stand near the prince who was working at his desk, asking him if he had dragged her to the palace in order to conquer the royal throne. Piercing the prince with her composure, the lady in the pink dress said that she guessed that because of the battle for the throne, he and his brother did not have the best relationship. But she was sure that the king trusted Risselt more than him. The servant who was standing nearby was surprised by the lady's words, which was evident from his face, because he could not understand how the lady, who had arrived at the palace only a few days ago, could talk about this. Remembering Duchess Eloise, the girl told the prince that he wanted to marry her in order to use the power of her family. But he was unable to do this either, since the power of her father, the Duke, could not be used. Having introduced the prince himself with threads from his hands, with which he supposedly controls someone, Yun said that after marrying the Duchess, his hands became even more tied, and therefore he wants to have a simple lady who can be easily manipulated. And she imagined the prince with threads for the reason that he uses them to move Yun herself, like a doll, who will now only fulfill his demands, as if she constantly obeys and is an ordinary tool for completing tasks. Looking seriously at the prince, the girl said that she had long understood that he needed a woman whom he could easily manipulate, who would take the place of the bride, becoming the princess of the state. As soon as the prince heard this truth, he immediately decided to direct his deadly, magical beam towards the main character, which Yun successfully turned away from and because of which it flew past her. And while the blue beam flickered and shone on the wall, the heroine herself pierced the prince with her black eyes, because she knew that the truth would make him incredibly angry. But that was what she intended to achieve. But the prince remained calm on the surface, pointing a finger with a magical blue glow at the lady, and ordering his servant to take Yun to the weapon so that she could choose one for herself. Because from the lady's radio, he realized that she seemed to have experience in using weapons. After this, the girl was about to leave the bird's office accompanied by a servant. But suddenly, the aristocrat ordered her not to appear before him in the dress she was wearing now, because it allegedly did not suit her. Hearing this, the angry little lion, because of whom everything around seemed to become darker, replied that in that case she would ask him for another dress, because otherwise she would stop dressing the way he liked. After some time, the girl, accompanied by the prince's servant, was already on the knight's training ground, which is why all the fighters looked at her, not understanding what a fragile lady in a cute dress was doing here. They noticed that a brunette with a very long ponytail truly has a unique beauty, because even in the ugliest dress, or even in a potato sack, she will look flawless, which all the guys around were sure of. But all talk about the beautiful lady was interrupted by one dark-skinned fighter with a scar on his face and a bare torso, who immediately ordered everyone to work, not understanding why the appearance of a certain aristocrat had knocked them off their work. And while the fighters continued their training, Yun and Kacher had already come to the weapons room, which is why the man in front of her was telling and gesturing with his hand that here she could choose any weapon for herself. The lady looked at the weapons, but also glanced at the servant, asking him about the warriors she had met, to which Kacher answered her that they were royal knights of the highest order, but that there were also commoners among them. Along the way, the girl took short swords into her hands, listening to Kacher's story, saying that all the swords here are made of silver, and this particular one has a beautiful red stone on the handle, which makes it more expensive and valuable. But despite the fact that this was the first time the lady had held such a dagger, She deftly took it and twirled it in one hand, realizing that it was very similar to her personal knife from her past life, which made it seem very convenient and practical to her. She smiled, telling Catcher that she would take him, and the guy himself looked at her with shock and amazement, not understanding what kind of past such a sweet and beautiful lady must have if she could handle a cold weapon. But he still hurried to introduce her to other swords, because of which he showed a long sword in his hands, saying that even the patterns on it were magnificent. But Yoon didn't even look at it, because she wasn't interested in it at all. The thing is, her attention was drawn to a dark wooden box in the shadow of the warehouse, which is why the lady asked if weapons could be stored in it. Stopping behind the main character, the guy said that many years ago it was a gift to the prince from the Hongyan dynasty, but now it is gathering dust in a warehouse, as if everyone has forgotten about it. She decided to open the box herself, which is why she saw 2 katanas in it, which not only had elegant, beautiful handles, but also red blades. And Catcher himself continued to tell that he himself had not seen the prince use them. The surprised lady picked up one sword, took off its cover, and began to examine the red blade in surprise, while Kacker said that it had such a color because of the crystal, which was mined with difficulty in the caves, which is why it looks perfectly clean. He also told the girl with a smile that thanks to the crystal in the blade, even people without magic but with mana can use charms, because the sword has very unusual properties. But in the end, this is not the real power of a person. Holding the sword in her hands, the girl looked at Catcher and asked him where she could find a person who could provide high-purity mana, to which the guy replied that in fact, there weren't that many such people. However, gesturing with his hand and smiling at the nice lady, he still said that all the soldiers here possessed high-frequency magic, which he told her about. Hearing this, the girl raised her hand to her chin and looked curiously at Catcher, asking him if the prince allowed her to take everything she wanted, does this mean that she can take any person for herself? Therefore, after some time, the main character was already standing not only next to Catcher, but also in front of all the fighters, examining them, while the servant introduced the lady to the knights and called her name, saying who she was. Absolutely all the warriors lined up in a row, bowing their heads to the protagonist when Catcher loudly proclaimed that she was the prince's beloved. Therefore, she must be respected, and all her orders must be carried out unquestioningly. After this, Yoon, accompanied by Catcher, began to pass by the warriors, asking them if anyone wanted to be a guard for the aristocrat, while receiving the salary that the order had. And then one tall, dark guy with a scar on his face answered Catcher that their task was not to be a toy or guards for someone, but to follow the prince in order to protect the kingdom and carry out his orders. He said with a serious face that their duty was to be in the royal guard and have big goals and ambitions, and not to be guards for one lady who always sits in the palace and just drinks tea with desserts. After hearing so many words, the female protagonist stopped in front of the dark, angry knight in the row, while he continued to tell Yoon that she could choose a guard from their other ranks, but not from this one, because they serve the prince. Catcher laughed, saying that he had completely forgotten that the prince's knights do not change those they follow at their own discretion, except perhaps according to the rule that implies respect for the stronger. All the knights started laughing because they said that such a fragile-looking and sweet lady could not become stronger than them. And so the Dark Warrior sighed, telling everyone to stop joking and just understand that the lady could not do anything here. They all said that there was no need to offend the lady in the pink dress, but the main character, listening to all this, only remained mysteriously silent, realizing that it was precisely through the battle that she would be able to prove her strength to everyone, which is a tradition among knights. And Catcher stood and smiled, looking at the warriors. She just decided to turn to Catcher and ask if he did all this on purpose, just so that everyone would refuse to be her guard and not provide her with the purest magic, which made the servant noticeably worried. Out of anger, the girl instantly pulled out the sword from Catcher's case, which made him amazed. But what surprised everyone even more was that the lady pointed the tip of the weapon at the guy's neck, asking if they respected the strongest here. And while the large and very sharp sword was only a couple of centimeters from the neck of the Dark Knight, who had previously expressed dissatisfaction, she exclaimed that on such an occasion they would arrange a fight so that she could prove to everyone the opposite. With her voice mad with rage, she looked straight at the tall warrior, saying that she didn't have any magic, so it was unfair to use it during a fight with her. And she also asked if something terrible would happen if she were to offend him now. The girl persuaded everyone to resolve the conflict by fighting, while Catcher stood behind her and could not find words from shock, because he was surprised by a woman who, in a cute dress, provoked the strongest knight and challenged him to a duel. However, the real shock for him was when the protagonist turned her head towards him and calmly ordered him to undress, if he was used to carrying out all the orders of the aristocracy and not being afraid of anything. The shocked catcher did not understand what the lady meant until she looked at him angrily and explained that she would not fight the knight in such an uncomfortable dress, so they would change clothes. A few minutes later, the main character's plan was successfully completed, because she reappeared before the warriors in a new image, in the form that Catcher was in, also holding a sword in her hand and telling everyone to start the competition. But while everyone was amazed at the girl's hips, her courage, and the fact that the woman generally agreed to fight with a real knight, the brunette himself, who was already holding his sword in his hand, said that he would make every effort to win and not disgrace the prince's name on his shoulders. The main character and the knight were already standing in front of each other and preparing to start the battle, while the warriors looking at them said that the tanned guy with a scar named Hawk clearly doesn't like women, so he wouldn't mind putting Yoon in her place. And on the ground sat Catcher, whom the main heroine had forced to change into her dress, because of which the guy bashfully waited for the fight to end quickly, and he could change, no longer catching the surprised glances of others. The warriors' fight had already begun, and Hawk decided to go on the attack first, heading towards the lady with the sword, already apologizing in advance for causing her pain and thus winning the duel in a few blows. Hawk intended to strike the lady with his long sword blade, but the girl managed to parry his blow with her own weapon, which was difficult for her, because the force with which her opponent attacked was not small. The lady noticed that it was too difficult for her to withstand the blows from Hawk's sword, so she dodged every swing towards her, realizing that she did not have as much experience in sword fighting as in hand-to-hand combat. And at the moment when the main character realized that she needed to make her move, she raised her heavy sword high, intending to strike the enemy. But with shock on her face, she realized that she would not be able to do this due to inexperience. Because when Haka jumped back one step from her, the lady slashed the blade of her sword with all her might at the guy himself, and the ground, making it look like she was doing it on purpose. With some purpose, and as expected, even the strongest and highest quality sword could not withstand such a blow, causing its blade to split with a ringing sound, and its tip to bounce off the ground, which only meant that it would no longer be convenient to fight with it. Surprised, Yoon decided to stop and look at the sword in amazement, touching its damaged blade and asking everyone how it could have broken so easily and why it was so fragile. While Keicher screamed in shock because his personal sword was easily broken, and all the spectators were greatly shocked, the main Gatinya only stood in a stance, preparing her fists, as if she had also guessed that it seemed that her opponent had used magic on her weapon, and therefore now she wanted to fight only with her hands. Looking at the lady, the dark-skinned guy put his sword back in its sheath and told the lady that in that case he would fight her with his fists, because otherwise the battle would be unfair. And he did not expect at all that the protagonist would not just wait for him to pounce on her first, but she herself went on the attack immediately after his words, which surprised and frightened the guy, who began to cover his face with his hands from her blows. Hack couldn't even breathe for a couple of seconds, because the girl instantly began to attack him not only with her hands, but also with her legs, swinging either directly at the man's face and forcing him to stagger. The lady's flexible and strong leg was right next to his neck and was about to give him a serious blow, which made Hawk shocked, not understanding where such a fragile lady had so much experience in fighting and where she got so much strength from. However, when he wanted to dodge at least the girl's leg, Yoon, taking advantage of his confusion, not only grabbed him by the hair, but also managed to hit him in the chest with her knee. The guy's mouth even started to drool when Yoon dealt him the first blow, but with such force that he was shocked to realize that it seemed that it would not be so easy for him to defeat his opponent. But the lady's final attack was a punch to Hawk's chin, which caused the guy to immediately fall backwards and onto the ground, while Yoon screamed at him that she had never lost in hand-to-hand combat. So for her, this was just another victory. With her eyes glistening with victory and joyful emotions, the girl looked at her opponent and told him that now it was she who had proven to him that she was stronger, and therefore there was no need to offend her with words anymore. Absolutely everyone looked at Madame with shock on their faces and with their jaws open, because until the last moment they did not believe that the biggest and strongest guy in their ranks would lose to a fragile woman in a pink dress. They looked at Hawk and Yoon, who looked at the guy who seemed to be no longer able to stand up, which amazed the spectators, and they whispered that it seemed like the knight would never be able to fight back against his opponent. Also looking at the defeated Hawk was Kasher, who was still wearing the main character's dress, But he realized with horror on his face that the prince's most devoted and talented fighter had lost to a woman who had knocked him out. After some time, he finally got up from the ground, but immediately grabbed his head, because he said that he could not see anything in front of him because his whole head was spinning, as if he was being attacked not by a person, but by a bear or a tiger. The lady looked at him with a smile, placing her hands on her belt and telling him that if he had recovered so quickly after being hit in the jaw, then it was very good and he could consider himself an experienced knight. But what surprised the Dark Knight most was that he had lost for the first time to a woman whom he had not even been able to injure. And from the realization of this, there was real shock on his face, and his whole body seemed to turn black from incredible shock. However, he still knelt down before Yoon and told her that he would admit his loss. And also, according to the agreement, he would become her guard, because the lady had personally proven her strength to him. In response, the lady only turned away from the guy, telling him that she no longer needed this, since she understood that he had a desire to be close to the prince and follow him. And she also clarified whether he believed that he would not be able to achieve his goals if he followed a woman. But this did not suit Hawk, because when the girl told him to forget about this duel altogether, as if it had never happened, he stood up and bowed, saying that he was still ready to serve her all his life, because he was a member of the royal order. The girl turned around and yelled at the guy when he knelt down in front of her and apologized for his rude remarks, saying that he would now serve her faithfully and truly to be her guard. The lady only smiled, telling Haku that she hoped that the prince would not mind that his knight had decided to follow the woman, and therefore she agreed that from now on he would be her personal bodyguard. However, everyone did not think about the fact that when the prince himself learned of this news, he looked at his servant in shock, wondering if it was really true that his faithful knight Hawk had become Yun's guard. Kachur was ready to cry in front of the prince from excitement, but standing in front of the aristocrat in a shirt, he spoke. I myself wanted to dissuade everyone from such an undertaking, but he did not succeed. However, most of all, the prince was surprised by the fact that Yoon had all this easily, when he literally persuaded Hawk to be in the order. He even grabbed his head, telling the servant that it was difficult to find a person with the 7th level of magical power in the entire kingdom. But Hawk, who possessed it, decided to follow some girl and serve her. But Kachur showed the prince his index finger, clarifying that if Yoon was his beloved, even if she took the knight away from him, it meant that this warrior also belonged to the aristocrat. And while the servant was persuading the prince to give him a new sword, because Yoon had broken his first one, the heroine herself was already in the palace and was telling the maids that she would now be happy to take a bath. But everyone was surprised only by how she was dressed, because the lady was in a man's uniform. The two maids began to look at Madame in amazement and ask her where she had put the previous pink dress, because the outfit she was wearing now was very revealing, since her legs were bare. The calm lady with the long ponytail only answered that everything was fine, and she didn't like wearing long skirts because it was uncomfortable. And she also asked once again if she could take a bath after a hard day. And when the maids told her that the bathroom was ready and that they would help her undress, the girl just waved her hand and began to walk away from them, saying that she didn't need any help and that she could handle everything herself. Remembering that the prince was also currently in the bath, the maids began to talk among themselves about how it would be okay if Yoon went in there too, because they were lovers. One maid with bangs and black hair began to worry and told her friend that it seemed like the prince was in a bad mood today and no one knew why. But the other maid calmed her down, saying that everything would be fine with Yoon. Meanwhile, the protagonist was already taking off her outerwear in order to bathe in a hot bath, wondering at the same time why the soldiers here were so physically weak and whether they were relying on their magic if they had such poor physical fitness. However, she did not expect at all that due to the slippery floor and objects that she did not notice, she would not only trip, but also fall into the bathtub, right on the body of the prince, who looked at the girl in shock. Yoon was no less shocked than the Aristocta himself, so she looked at him with wide eyes, not even noticing how she was touching the prince's chest with her palm, which made him even more shocked. Although the girl liked to touch the prince's chest softly, she still removed her hand so as not to embarrass him, after which the guy looked at her in shock, asking why she was here. The lady, angry at the guy, decided to stand in front of him and put her hands on her chest, saying that she didn't know at all that he was here, so it wasn't her mistake, but a simple misunderstanding. She turned towards the exit and angrily told the guy to continue washing himself and forget what happened between them, because she would wait outside until he could calmly take a bath. But suddenly the prince grabbed her wrist, causing the surprised girl to turn to him as the aristocrat told her that she should not go out, as she should not forget her status. Looking into her eyes, he said that she should always remember that she was his beloved, and therefore they both should not even give everyone doubts about the fact that they were not a couple. And if the lady came out now, the servants would think something was wrong. The girl decided that she would take a bath in another room, which is why after a while she was already in it, telling the prince through the wall that she came in Kacher's clothes because she had changed clothes with him for the battle, because she was not comfortable in the dress. Hearing this, the guy grabbed his head and told the girl that she did not look like a lady at all and did not even stand next to this status, because she decided to take up arms and fight with men equally. But suddenly, wrapped in a light towel, the girl decided to appear before the prince and angrily say that she had never been a lady, so it would be a mistake to think that she was gentle and sweet, a fragile cutie. Seeing the lady in this state, the astonished prince blushed and shouted, could she not embarrass him? Because she was a girl and there should be at least some drops of decency in her, so as not to stand before him almost naked. But the girl in response only grabbed her head just like the prince, telling him to wash it quickly and not to talk nonsense to her, because she was not going to stand here in her outerwear, experiencing the steam and heat. Already getting ready to leave the bath, the dissatisfied prince said that he should warn her that he already has a girlfriend that he likes, because he will not fall in love with her even if she constantly seduces him. Hearing this, the heroine was seriously amazed, because she did not understand at all why the prince decided that she wanted to get his attention. So she looked at him in shock, when the veins on her face stood out from anger and indignation. Putting on a robe, the prince even said that even if she was wearing the dress of the lady he liked, even if she had the same hairstyle or character, he still would not love her. But he did not even guess that Yoon did not care. She looked at him in shock and was at a loss for words when the prince in the dark robe calmly began to say that she just needed to remember that she was only a show wife to mislead everyone around her. However, immediately after these words, he immediately picked up the girl in his arms and began to carry her from the bathroom down the corridor, telling her that they were just playing the role of a guy and a girl, a loving couple. And while Yoon did not understand where the prince even thought that she was in love with him, he walked out into the corridor with her in his arms, where they were met by many smiling maids who immediately began asking the prince what book he wanted to read before going to bed and what to prepare for him. Gradually, a dark sky with bright stars fell over the palace itself, and everyone began to prepare for bed, which is what the protagonist and the prince did in one of the rooms of the luxurious mansion. The lady was already by the bed in her nightgown and asked the prince how long his maid named Mia had been working for him, to which he replied that she had been serving him for more than 3 years, after which he asked what she needed this information for. The guy continued to be next to her and walk around the room, while Yoon answered him that she had simply agreed about the maid, and now she was interested in knowing why he needed her as a shield, if he already had a lady of the heart. The lady asked the young man about this with irritation and discontent, as if she now did not understand what role she played in the palace, if he had a lady of his heart, and she was just playing the role of a puppet that was being controlled. Suddenly, the prince became more sad and withdrawn, because they explained to the lady that his beloved had long been dead and she would forever remain in his heart, because she had long been cruelly treated. Yi-Yun looked at the guy with defeat, who told her in a sad voice that he would no longer see her eyes, would not hear her voice or discontent, would not see how jealous she was, and therefore he was no longer looking for another lady. The heroine of the story apologized to him for possible rude statements and words, explaining that she had not even guessed about this before. But the prince remained silent, as if something in his heart was hurting. He decided to sit quietly at the table and read a book before going to bed, telling the lady that there was nothing wrong with her words, and he also changed the subject, asking the girl about the time she was almost killed by the Duchess's maid, and he clarified that it happened in broad daylight. However, when the lady replied that she did not think the Duchess was trying to kill her, the prince folded the book and looked at the lady, telling her not to be so kind, because if the Duchess was not trying to kill her, then her family was. He looked at Yun with his blue, angry eyes and told her that it was important to understand that if she made even one mistake, her life would end and only one of the Duchess and she would survive. But the girl with long hair, who listened attentively to the guy's words with sadness and understanding, replied that here she and the Duchess were just pawns who did not decide anything in the struggle for power. The prince did not respond to her words and only said that they needed to sleep already, because outside the snow-white palace there was already darkness of night, because of which there was no light even in the windows of the mansion. The next morning, in another place, namely the Tilkio estate, it was not so cheerful because the Duchess was sitting in her bedroom and had not left it for 3 days, as the maid told her, while the lady sat embarrassed on the bed. There was a maid next to her who tried to cheer the Duchess up with words, but she was unsuccessful, because the lady said nothing when the maid asked her how she was going to win the prince's heart if she sat there all day. The maid, who clearly had some evil plan, smiled slyly, persuading her mistress to get out of bed and start acting as if this was what she personally wanted. But the purple-haired lady was still hiding in the shadows, sitting on her bed, asking her new maid if she had been sent to her by the same person she was now thinking about. In her mind, she still recalled how the previous maid had met a tragic death when her body was pierced by a magical sword, causing Eloise to excitedly ask the new maid if she was afraid of dying in the same way. When her face was in an ominous shadow, she smiled sweetly, telling Eloise that they were just ants in this huge system, and their task now was to make the prince fall in love and then marry him. Eloise did not believe that love could be used to eliminate competitors, and so she decided to get out of bed and put on a chic purple dress in order to appear before her brother and father and make a curtsy. The girl sat down on the red chair in front of her father and brother, who were also sitting in their places, talking about how Eloise looked bad and that she had no reason to grieve just because her only and unnecessary servant had died. Sitting stiffly on a red chair, the lady with purple hair and dress turned to the Pope, confessing that she could not forget the bloody picture she saw before her when her maid was pierced by a magic sword. With emotion and tears in her eyes, Eloise said that just a second ago she saw a living servant in front of her, and a few moments later she was no longer alive due to one strong blow. However, Eliza's father, with his cane and mustache, angrily replied to his daughter that the death of her maid was of no importance, because what should be important to her now was her engagement to the prince and how to become his bride. After this, the evil and strict father ordered his daughter to leave him alone with her brother, which caused the lady to quickly get up from her chair and go to her new maid, who stood silently in the room and listened to everything. But before the girl finally left, Dad looked at her and shouted, asking how things were going in the northern mines, as if addressing his children. The first to answer the Pope's question was Eloise's brother, who said with a smile that measures had been taken to extract rhodolite and that so far everything was going well. But he had no idea that this did not suit his sister. She turned to her father and brother in shock, saying that she knew the dangerous terrain very well and was therefore sure that there would not be many fossils on the mountain range, and that the costs of digging would exceed the income. But her words were quickly interrupted by the man who was holding a glass of red wine in his hands, and who immediately ordered Eloise to be silent and not to object to anyone. This man turned out to be her brother, who only laughed at his sister's words, telling her that she was just a little girl who was incapable of knowing anything more than tea parties and relationships with men. And Eliza was left standing hopelessly in front of her father and brother, listening to them tell her that she was just a simple woman who had no right to interfere in the affairs of men, especially those concerning family and finances. That's why, when everything around her seemed to cease to exist, she only bowed her head down and agreed with the men's words, sadly listening to her brother's words that, in addition to this, he also agreed with someone who would take care of their nuisance. Putting an empty glass on the table, the guy said that the woman who had recently settled in the prince's palace had lived too long and his descendant had hired an assassin who was ready to eliminate her because he was as strong as the knight in the kingdom's order. And while Eloise's brother meant that he wanted to eliminate the main character, Yoon herself was already on the street. But she was holding two swords with red blades in her hands because she was offering the knights to fight her. The girl said that she would fight someone without using magic, but she still made every warrior marvel at her strength, because they realized with shock that without magic, they were practically powerless against the experienced lady. Noticing that after her offer to fight in battle, almost all the soldiers ran away from her in fear. Hak, who had always followed Yoon since his defeat in the duel, appeared behind the protagonist. He bowed, causing the surprised lady to turn her head towards him while the boy asked her if she would mind if she took part in her training and kept her company. Hak even looked at the lady and admitted that he would do everything in his power to fight her for real, and as a true warrior, which was also visible in his confident, black eyes. Turning to her new partner, the girl told him with a smile that she had forgotten the most important thing, and that was why she was now offering him to teach her magic, if he had the charm, and not the weakest one. And while the protagonist was training with her new friend and talking to him, Eloise remembered how she stood as if in emptiness and listened to her brother's words when he promised that he would deal with Yoon soon. She herself sat on a chair and was sad, bowing her head down, while a maid was near her and holding something in her hand, asking her mistress why she was so sad. It seemed that the smile never left her face, because this time too she smiled broadly, asking the sad and downcast madam whether she was sad because of the words of her father and her brother. The maid began to apply red lipstick to Eloise's lips with a brush, reassuring her that without killing Yun, they would not be able to win the prince's heart, and that this was necessary so that Eloise would become his bride. When Eliza looked at her maid with a sweet but very sad look, the girl decided to cheer her up, saying that she was absolutely beautiful and that she would certainly be able to win the prince's heart. Continuing to smile at her mistress, the maid said that she just needed to try to keep her head up in order to survive and win the heart of the prince, without disappointing anyone in her family. And while Eloise understood that everything in her life was already predetermined and she was not given the role that she should play, the surprised main character looked at Hack when he told her that magic cannot be learned, even if she asked him to learn exactly this. He stood in front of her and told her that spiritual mana needed to be awakened from an early age using a special spiritual stone, and he also asked if she knew this. The guy in front of her was extremely serious, telling her that mana could not be awakened as an adult, so he could not carry out her request. But the lady only remained silent. Looking at her red sword, the girl realized that now, because she didn't have any magic, she would have to use another person's magic to somehow enhance her potential and strength. But Hawk still bowed before her, smiling and saying that he would gladly put his spiritual power into her weapon, causing the girl to smile, telling him to do so. After that, real magic began to happen between the main character and Hawk, because the guy touched the red sword with his hand, which caused magic to immediately happen around both of them. Hawk told the girl that she would be fine if she was with him, but the lady really wanted to test the strength of magic. So when the blade of her sword began to glow, she swung it with all her might, causing the magic to hit the ground hard like lightning. Looking more closely at the ground, the lady realized that what was left was not just a crack, but a real gap into which it was dangerous to fall. Chu Ellie was surprised, because she did not think that the force would be so great. She looked in shock at the result of her swing, and understood that if absolutely every member of the royal order had such power and destruction, it meant that they were incredibly strong and did not even need combat techniques. However, when it was already dark and the day was coming to an end, the lady turned to him in shock, not understanding why Hawk was sitting on his knees, because she had just spent the whole day training to swing a sword with the guy's magic. Hawk seemed to be shaking because he was uneasy, and he also quietly answered the heroine that it was all because of him, because his magic had run out, and that was why he felt weak in his body, as if after training. The lady immediately ran up to him, realizing that the use of magical power was limited, so she touched Hawk's body, apologizing for her training and ignorance and realizing that her partner was very tired. In response, the guy only blushed, telling the girl that she shouldn't worry so much about him, because he just needed to rest and everything would be fine. His strength would recover on its own. However, both of them did not do what they were hunted for, because when the protagonist sat next to Hawk, a magic arrow was already flying towards her with lightning speed, which belonged to an experienced killer. But she did not manage to harm the lady in any way, because Hawk instantly noticed the approach of danger and put out his palm, due to which the arrow pierced his hand, while with the other he held Yun to himself. They both stood up from the ground and looked at the one on the building in shock, asking him how he dared to attempt on Yun's life and how he got into the Royal Knight's training ground. But the assassin only laughed. But the one who had a black mask but whose red hair was visible told Haku that he didn't need to know all this, because now he only needed to beg him for mercy so that he wouldn't kill him on this very spot. Hawk only pulled Yun closer to him for safety, telling the protagonist that their opponent was definitely strong if he could get past the guards without making any sounds, so he would distract him now, and if he asked to find a way to escape. Hearing this, the killer only laughed and looked at them with crazy eyes, saying that they would not be able to escape anywhere, but immediately asked them to do whatever they thought necessary, because he would kill them both anyway. But the killer didn't even suspect that Yoon herself was obsessed with the idea of not letting the enemy escape. So she showed him her swords with crazy eyes and said that if he had a lot of magic, she had to get him. Taking the swords in her hands, the girl looked at the one who was on the stone building and understood that he had an incredible amount of mana, which she needed in order to control the swords with charms. However, their rival, who was already preparing his magic to kill not only Yun, but also her guard, only laughed, asking his victims if they would pay him more if he took the life of not only the girl, but also Hawk. The first to notice the smile and strange behavior of the main character was Hawk, who looked at him with bewilderment at the Balotse, when he realized that the girls were not afraid of the enemy at all, but on the contrary, wanted to fight him as soon as possible and get his magic. But while he was in shock, the killer was already intending to use his magical powers on the girl and him, which is why unusual golden glows immediately appeared around his palms, which he seemed to be accumulating in order to attack. But Hawk wasn't going to just look at him and wait, because he stood in front of the protagonist and made his magic appear in the form of a sharp blue sword as he glared at his opponent and asked him how he dared to introduce himself like that in front of the prince's chosen one. While also asking who exactly hired him to kill the main character, Hack had already made his first strike and directed his magical powers at the building itself, swinging his sword in front of it with all his might and causing a blue glow to appear. And because of just one blow from him, the building instantly began to collapse with a roar, which is what Hawk wanted, because the killer who was sitting on it earlier probably had a hard time surviving such a catastrophe, especially a sudden one. The main character looked at this in amazement, covering her face with her hands and not believing that one swing of a magic sword could cause such an effect that everything around would literally collapse. However, Hawk himself did not let her look at this miracle. He immediately grabbed her by the waist and carried her along, angrily telling her not to stand in one place, but to run while there was time, and while he would distract the killer. But they were unable to escape from the experienced mercenary, because his magic was able to reach them, which crashed into the ground with a roar, causing stones to fly into the air and the earth to split into several pieces. And while she didn't understand why she was having difficulty dodging the enemy's attacks, and guessing that it was because she didn't have any magic, she stood next to Hawk when the entire ground in front of them was already broken, and all because of the magic of the red-haired guy. He prepared a new portion of his magic for them, which was accumulating in his hand, and also talked, laughing, that Hawk had quite good reactions and movements, as for someone who owns magic. But with his eyes, he slyly looked not only at Hawk himself, but also at the lady, realizing that her bodyguard turned out to be very strong, and he even needed to make an effort to first deal with him, and then kill Yun. And while the killer was preparing, Hack with a blue sword came up to the heroine and told her that she just needed to choose the best moment to escape, while he would be inflicting new blows on the enemy. However, when the girl looked at the guy and did not even move from fear, of which she did not have a drop, the lady said that she would not leave him here under any circumstances, even if he really wanted to. She also took his wounded palm, which was still bleeding, and said that he was badly wounded, and because of this, she was not warming up to run away from here, leaving her alone with danger and with a big wound. She looked at his palm and said that this time she would take responsibility and try to solve her problem, while Hawk was kneeling in front of her and listening to her words in surprise. He was so stunned that his mouth dropped open, because no one expected a woman to speak to him with such bold and decisive words, as if she were a real knight who saw only the goal of killing her opponent. Smiling very widely, Yun told Haku to his face that she simply needed that killer to recharge her magical power, so she wanted to attack him together, because in that case he would definitely lose. So after a few seconds, they both stood in a stance, and Yoon said decisively that now, if she couldn't sense the magical attack, they could play it to their advantage, which she intended to do. And the killer himself was already intending to use his power on the girl and her bodyguard, so now he was getting into a stance to attack, discontentedly asking his opponents what they were chatting about. And a second after his words, an incredibly huge beam of light began to glow in the direction of the heroes, which was the spell of the killer, who incredibly wanted to kill his opponents with one blow, strong and accurate like this laser. He was incredibly surprised when his huge beam of magnesium didn't kill his opponent, but only crashed against the swing of Hawk's sword, which instantly made all his spells spark and pair, and made him realize that this guy was truly hard to kill. The mercenary was angry, but continued to hold the defense, using his magic to prevent Hawk from attacking him, also wondering why such a strong and invincible man decided to follow the prince, and even more so to be a loyal guard of some lady. But he didn't even suspect that the main character also intended to quickly put her red swords to use. So she grabbed their handles and wanted to quickly take revenge on the killer who insulted not only her, but also Hawk. With an angry face, the main character was already running around the killer in order to attack him suddenly and decisively, telling herself that she would not allow anyone to call Hawk a dog or call anyone that. The assassin's hand, which emitted strong, shining magic, was already about to do something more destructive, causing the guy's palm to start shining, because he wanted to teach the girl a lesson, noticing that she wanted to play him. However, he never managed to accomplish what he had planned, because the red blade of the main character's sword easily pierced his palm almost exactly the same way he did to Haku. The lady with a wide, crazy smile sold holding the sword in order to inflict even more injuries on the guy, shouting that he deserved it, while the killer's hand itself began to bleed, and he himself was in shock. With eyes burning with rage and revenge, the girl named Yun mocked the killer, saying that she had repaid him for the wound on Hawk's hand, which she was incredibly happy about, and which made her smile incredibly sincerely. Shocked by such an action, the killer with a mask and red hair could not believe that this had happened. So, as if petrified, he held his hand outstretched and looked at the heroine in amazement. However, there was also a danger waiting for him on the other side, which he was able to dodge because he put his hand in front of Hawk's magical attack, who, swinging his sword, angrily asked him how he dared to be distracted from the battle. But after that, Hawk decided to attack his opponent with incredible force, which is why one swing of his sword was enough for a blinding beam to appear in front of the killer, which intended not only to push the opponent away, but also to destroy everything around. There was an incredible roar as cracks and holes appeared on the originally flat ground, and the killer himself, who had been in front of Yoon and Hawk a second ago, disappeared, having been pushed away from them by the blast wave. Having crashed into a tree with his back, the killer no longer wanted to get up and fight back, because he had no strength, and so he only groaned and could not catch his breath, trying to bring himself to his senses. Hawk and Yun looked at the killer and realized with shock that they not only managed to defeat the criminal and weaken him, but also make him lose consciousness, because the heroine was the first to notice this, thanks to the fact that the red-haired guy showed no signs of life. But as soon as she started talking about the killer no longer being conscious, Hawk himself next to her began to stagger from exhaustion and was about to fall to the ground, which greatly surprised the girl with the long tail, calling him by name. She decided to quickly grab him in her arms and gently lay him on the ground, touching his chest and anxiously calling his name, as if he was about to answer her. But with each passing second, she realized that it seemed that Hawk was truly exhausted. Looking at his face, which was all covered in small scratches, the girl understood that now Hawk had finally spent all his magic on the battle, which is why he urgently needed rest. Then sadness and guilt awoke in the girl's heart for being the one who made Hawk feel bad. So she looked at him with sadness, apologizing for everything that happened and apologizing for causing a destructive battle. The lady didn't even suspect that at the moment when she thought it was all over, the assassin behind her was able to muster the strength to not only stand up, but also slowly walk towards the lady and create magic with his whole hand to attack. But the heroine herself turned out to be neither stupid nor naive, because she swung her red sword right in front of the stunned killer's face, causing the bloody magic beam to block his path to her. Yun looked at the guy with her furious and maddened eyes and said that she could feel the murderous aura from people like him from afar, because in fact, she had died from it in her past life. The killer began to stand in front of the lady very weakly and sluggishly when magic began to sparkle around him, and he also said that he really underestimated her and therefore would now leave her alive, but in 2 days he would definitely return to kill her. With red, long hair and an angry look, he stared at the girl and told her to thank him for the fact that she still had 2 days left to live peacefully and without incident. However, as soon as he retreated even one step, the heroine immediately stood up from the ground with a red sword in her hand and rushed after him, intending to swing her weapon straight at him and shouting that there would be no next time. While smiling and shouting that he was the one who should become her magic power bank, the lady had already raised her hand with the katana up, attacking him with all her might, and so confidently that the shocked killer could not escape. The surprised stranger looked at the girl with wide eyes and did not understand why the lady was acting like a hungry wolf, but he was still preparing to fight off her attacks, although he was not sure that he could resist her. His doubts were justified, because the girl quickly swung her red sword with such force that the entire earth in front of the guy cracked and warped and forced him to fall to his knees. And the lady easily managed to brush away her opponent's sword, who was already lying on the ground and could not move, because the shockwave and incredible magic made him lose all his strength and fall. While the enemy was shocked to realize that all his bones were broken and he couldn't even move, and didn't understand where that woman got so much strength from, Yoon herself looked at Hawk, who was still on the ground, realizing that even when he was unconscious, she could use his magic. After that, the long-legged protagonist hurried to grab her opponent by the collar and lift him off the ground, asking what to do with him now, while the killer coughed and told the lady to let him go. But because of this, the main character only smiled, asking her enemy if he wanted her to let him go, as if this was a reason for her to laugh. The girl continued to hold him by the collar and not let him go, which made the long-haired guy unable to move, angrily asking the lady what she was trying to achieve and persuading her to let him go. But Yun had no intention of pardoning the one who intended to kill her, so she looked menacingly into his eyes and asked who hired him, because she immediately realized that such a killer clearly had a customer who wanted her dead. However, when the angry man said that she was just the prince's mistress and she didn't need to know, the long-haired lady grabbed his head with one hand and with the other was about to remove his mask from his face, saying that she was tired of all this. Imagine her surprise when, taking off her mask, she realized that in front of her was, apparently, a girl, and not a man, because the red-haired man has a cute appearance and face with prominent eyelashes. She continued to hold him by the collar and ask if he was, as it turned out, a beauty, when the guy answered that, on the contrary, he was a guy and would definitely kill her, which he said with incredible anger and hatred. Yun didn't take his words seriously, so she laughed, smiling at him, saying that she really wanted him to be by her side and not hide just to kill her. Hearing this, the guy was surprised, because he thought that his rival would first try to kill him, and not spare him, which is why he looked at her with amazement, clarifying what he meant. But the lady in front of him only made a thoughtful look, telling him that he now had the option of dying at her hands, and also the option of following her instructions and being her person. And then she could give him what he wanted. At this point, the killer realized that he had not completed his task at all, but on the contrary, had gotten himself into a problem from which he clearly could not get out if the girl, who possessed incredible strength, told him to choose between death and obedience. But a thought about his own sister flashed through his mind, whom he so wanted to help. And that is why the guy now fell to his knees in front of the heroine, saying that if she gives him enough money to save his sister, she can take his life for herself without any questions. Looking at her sadly, the killer also said that if he became her bodyguard, he would no longer be able to be a hired killer, so he was not sure what to do. The guy was very surprised when Yun started telling him about some DNA and how it had not been found yet, and therefore it was very easy to fake the information, and she also found a mistake somewhere. The smiling heroine looked at the killer and told him that he could not become a bodyguard, as he would arouse suspicion among the royal order, where no one knew him. But thanks to his cute appearance, she knew that she could give him another role. When Yoon explained that with his feminine looks and hair, he could easily become a maid, the boy became indignant, asking her if she wanted to make a woman out of him by putting him in dresses. He blushed and looked at the heroine in shock, asking her if she wanted to make fun of him or humiliate him by forcing him to work as a maid in the prince's palace. But he had no idea that the protagonist's plans were serious. The killer screamed that he would never wear a maid's uniform under any circumstances, because he did not intend to be just some nice maid after working as a dangerous and formidable killer. However, when Yoon said that only the maids could be around her all the time, which was safe, the red-haired boy suddenly realized that there was meaning in her words, because it was truly brilliant. But he still didn't want to humiliate his manhood. At this time, the girl looked at him as if with boredom, realizing that all the emotions of this man were written on his face, and she understood perfectly well that he did not want to humiliate himself, but also wanted to get money for his sister, to be safe. Then she decided to cheer him up by sitting on his lap, and with a sly look saying that if he agreed to this, he would show that he was a real man, very cool and courageous, who was ready to do anything for the sake of his family. Hearing this, the guy really thought about the lady's words because for the second time an epiphany awoke in his head, when he realized that his action might seem more decisive and respectful than it seemed at first glance. Therefore, 2 days after these events, a lady in a beautiful red dress was sitting in the library and reading a book, asking her maid Wei what this or that word meant, to which the maid answered that the text was about a village under an apple tree, also showing her her index finger. And while the main character was studying the language of the world, comparing it with English, a servant entered her library to inform the lady that Hawk had woken up after losing consciousness and seemed to be doing quite well. Looking at the servant named Kasher, she thanked him for his help, but he replied that there was no need to thank him, because he would do whatever she asked, unconditionally and immediately. And while Kasher didn't understand what exactly this woman was doing to Hawk, who was the strongest royal fighter, who ended up lying unconscious for 2 days, the protagonist waved her hand at the maid, saying that she would come to her later. Wei bowed to the lady, saying that she would of course wait for her to continue studying the words later. And after the heroine left, Wei turned to a new red-haired maid named Rika, telling her to help her clean her room and make her bed, while Rika herself tried to act feminine without revealing her male gender. Noticing that the new girl wasn't smiling, Wei advised her to be nice and polite more often, causing Rika to start apologizing, trying to smile more and act like a nice girl. Smiling at her new friend, who was not really a friend at all, Wei said that even though she was recommended by the mistress herself, she would still punish her for all her misdeeds and teach her everything. But after that, she immediately stopped smiling. Looking at Rika with complete seriousness, Wei ordered the red-haired lady to finish cleaning the library, and she would come and air it out later to see if she had completed the task. But upon hearing that Rika would go without dinner today in order to constantly work and study, the killer, disguised as a sweet girl, became indignant, as if screaming in his head and telling himself why he was being punished like this. While Rika was learning all the work of a maid and was amazed at her new duties, the main character had already entered Hawk's room and came closer to his bed, where he was lying, telling him not to move or get up. But the guy was still surprised by the appearance of the prince's mistress, looking at her with amazement. And that's why he asked what she was doing here, as if he didn't think that the first person who would want to see him would be Yun. Coming closer to him in a red short dress, the lady admitted that she was worried about him because he had been unconscious for 2 whole days, which made her think about the most terrible things. So she asked Hawk with complete seriousness and even excitement how he felt, looking at him with her dark and shining eyes, in which there was always energy and life. However, the man in the bed in front of her never answered the question of how he felt, because he only apologized for passing out and for making her worry, saying that he would now train twice as hard to be worthy of her. But the lady in the black and red dress standing in front of him said that she had spent all of the killer's magical power on him, and if she relied only on his mana, then there would be very little chance of success for both of them, practically none. The girl in front of him also said that she continued to use his magic even after he passed out, for which she apologizes profusely, and says that she understands why he was unconscious for 2 whole days. But the one with black eyes, bangs, and a noticeable scar on his face looked at the girl with honesty and sincerity, admitting that he never really understood her thoughts. The surprised girl was silent and listened to the guy telling her that she was the prince's beloved, and that if he took the throne, she would become a queen, which was also incredibly promising. So when he was now lying in bed and looking at her, and also lowering his head down, he asked the brave lady why a lady like her wanted to practice martial arts and fighting. But the girl stood in front of him and his bed, saying that she did not consider him unworthy of her at all, because he was the only person she could trust completely. The surprised boy opened his eyes wider, asking Yun what she meant, but suddenly the girl outdid him, sitting down on the bed and putting her index finger to her lips, telling him to be quieter and answer his question about who he would save if she and the prince needed help at the same time. And Hawk couldn't answer the girl the first time, because he looked at her in shock and understood that the lady wanted to know who he was more loyal to, Yun or the third prince. And while the main character was asking Haku questions, the new friend, disguised as a maid with red hair and the name Rika, was still wiping the shelves with books so that there was not a single speck of dust on them, and so that he would not be scolded. Sometimes the guy looked at his fake breasts, because instead of real ones, he had fabric that only imitates female forms. But because of them, he felt very uncomfortable moving and especially raising his arms, which is why he couldn't understand how ladies tolerated this discomfort. Another problem he had was his shoes, which had high heels, and he couldn't walk at all, which meant he was constantly falling, and his heels hurt from discomfort. And while Rika was falling because of her heels, 2 maids were already heading down the corridor towards her, talking about the new servant, asking each other what she liked and whether she would like the sandwiches that one of them had brought. One dark-haired, sweet lady was saying that a certain maid named Lillian was very sweet, and therefore she was sure that she would like her too. And by this time, they were already approaching the library where Rika was. But as soon as they entered the library, they saw a new maid, seemingly confused, holding something strange in her hands and looking at them with shock, as if the 2 friends had entered completely unexpectedly. As it turned out, the guy just wanted to take off the annoying breast pad that was bothering him. But as soon as the maids noticed such a strange event, the killer in the form of Ricky blushed, not even knowing what to say. The 2 maids immediately realized that their new lady's breasts were fake, and that the woman in front of them was not a lady at all. And when the killer began to hastily hide the pad under his clothes, they asked him in shock who he even was. Coming closer to the guy, they began to ask him who he really was. But the shocked and confused killer began to say that they didn't need to burst into the library so suddenly, to which one of the friends replied that they just wanted to greet her. Rika looked at the girls with a sly look and realized that she seemed to have given away that she was a guy. But she also realized that she needed to play the role of a cute and new maid until the very end. To the killer's surprise, it seems the two girlfriends didn't even realize that he was actually a guy, because they started telling him, addressing him as a girl, that she wouldn't be able to win the prince's attention with her big curves. Hearing this and realizing that the llamas were only thinking about the fact that Rika only needed the prince's attention, the killer was truly shocked, which was evident from his face because he had not thought at all about the aristocracy, and even less about how to please him. And when Rika did everything to be accepted as an ordinary girl and a maid, Yun continued to communicate with Hawk, or rather to ask him who he would save if she were drowning at the same time as the prince. A minute later, the guy decided to answer sternly, saying that he would have saved the prince first because he was ideal for the role of king. But if he chose to serve Yun, then in that case he would have saved her, and not the aristocrat. But the lady in the maroon dress, who was charismatically holding a lock of her hair in her hand, replied that from the very beginning the only person who could command Hawk was the prince. Sitting down on the bed in front of him, the girl explained that he had sworn allegiance to her, only because she was the prince's beloved, and not because of the strength she had shown him in their very first duel. And after the guy said sadly that everything was so, Yun, satisfied with the answer, got out of bed and said with a smile that it was his devotion to the prince that was her strongest support that she would use. She smiled at him and looked into his eyes with incredible cunning, asking Hawk if he would allow himself to be used by the prince's Raleigh if he was so devoted to him. And while the beloved of the heir to the throne was planning to get everything from her people, disputes and disagreements did not subside in the residence of the Tilkio family, and all for the reason that the family gathered again, sat down at the red furniture and began to indignantly think about where their mercenary was, whom they gave the task to kill Yun. Eloise's brother was worried and told their father that it seemed that their mercenary would not contact them again, and the head of the family was even more indignant, asking those present how they could have failed to kill some talentless girl. But most of all, Eloise was surprised by this, who was also in the company of the family and listened to her conversations, amazed that Yun was alive, and the killer, on the contrary, had disappeared, as if he had been eliminated, and not the heroine. She sat on the red chair and felt relieved that Yun survived even though she was her enemy. But suddenly the maid behind her said that if the plan failed, then she would take on the matter. The maid was in an ominous shadow, smiling, and also placed her hand on her chest and told Eloise's father that she could be relied on, since her master would not punish any of them, and that they should simply leave the matter to her. The maid with short hair was standing next to Eloise and was saying with a sly smile that her mistress would definitely marry the prince, and all the problems would then be solved by themselves. However, Eloise herself did not seem to be happy with her father's and her family's plan at all, because her face showed real sadness as she realized that she could only follow her own plan and not do what she wanted. The girl's father sat calmly on the red sofa and said that in that case he would hand over the plan to the maid, and also asked her to convey his greetings to the prince when they returned to his palace again. It was not quiet in the palace itself either, because the prince's older brother, named Risselt, was having fun in his own way, namely, forcing the lady with green hair to make love. The lady screamed and asked the aristocrat to stop, but he seemed not to hear her, because he wanted to satisfy only his own desires, which is why he sweated and exposed his toned body. And near the bed, on which Risselt was having sex with the girl, the servant stood and remained silent, as if waiting for everything to end and for the crown prince to pull back the curtains in order to leave the sleeping place. While doing his business, the prince asked the servant about how things were going regarding what interested him, to which the servant, who was looking at the shadows of the couple, replied that Yun was alive and well, and that no mercenary had killed her. The boy adjusted his golden hair with his hand and smiled, telling the servant that it seemed that Yun was not a weak cat, but a formidable predator who would not let anyone be offended and who should not be underestimated. Kaka remained calm, asking Mr. Risselt if he needed to send people to resolve the matter, considering that the heroine was still alive. At the same time as he wanted to satisfy his desires thanks to the green-haired lady, he also remembered the appearance of the protagonist, who seemed to have charmed him, and he especially remembered her eyes, because of which he tried to find her in other girls. Just thinking about the main character made the blonde man even more excited, and so he treated the lady in front of him like a doll, thanks to which he could represent Yun instead of her. At the same time, the main character was busy with her plans, which is why she was in front of Hawk, explaining to him that she needed reliable people whom she would successfully use. And Hawk was shocked when the heroine offered him to be used by her. But he himself understood that he had no choice, because Yoon was using his devotion to the prince for his own purposes. So, while in bed, he agreed with the girl, after which he asked what to do now with the killer who wanted to kill her, and whether she really wanted to use his magical abilities for herself. Hack warned the girl that he was a murderer and therefore should not be trusted. But the lady only raised her hand to her face and said that she only needed strength from him, and the murderer himself needed help, because he wanted to save his sister. The lady just remembered the moment when he fell on his knees before her and began to talk about his sister, the only person close to him, for whom he wants to do everything possible, just to save her. Yun also remembered that, according to the killer's story, his sister with a long red braid was taken by slave traders and made a slave out of her, which is why he wants to return her and give her freedom. Hak bowed his head and said that in that case it would take a lot of money to buy out the mercenary's sister, because now it is not ordinary people who can afford a slave but real rich people. And when Yoon admitted that she had absolutely no funds at the moment, because the prince had only given her dresses and weapons, Hak said that he had savings, which seemed to be enough to ransom the girl. But the main Garyon, crazy with her ideas, looked at Hak and thanked him for his help, and said that she would not pay a penny for the ransom, because if the slave trader stole her, then he could do the same. The surprised guy looked at the lady as she stood in front of him and said that what she hated most was when people were traded, when people were exchanged for something, as in deals, as if they were animals or currency. The amazed Hawk looked at the girl and admitted to her that she had just said exactly the same phrase that the prince had once said to him, which is why he thought that she was very similar to him. The main character was also surprised by this, asking Hack what he meant and looking at him with genuine interest. But as it turned out, the knight was referring to events from the past. The thing is, when he first met the prince, when he was kneeling before him with his bare torso, he cut the chains that bound Hawk's hands with one blow of his sword, and then told him that they were all people, not slaves. That's why now he looked at the lady with a smile, telling her that incident and also adding to his words, saying that although they are real, royal persons, they treat slaves the same way as people. Hawk's words left the girl silent and thinking, causing the room to go dead silent, and Yoon looked at his bodyguard with his lips parted. While Hawk was revealing a new side to his mistress and telling her his past, Rika, who is actually a red-haired assassin, was doing her job, which is why she was now carrying a tray with a drink in her hands after cleaning the room. In the role of Ricky, he complained that the uniform was extremely comfortable and that he was literally showered with work, punished for the slightest offense, and now he was carrying the potion for the aristocrats for a kilometer because the palace was incredibly large. He felt pain and discomfort, which caused tears to appear in his eyes, and the guy himself made the most realistic expressions of discomfort, because his feet hurt because of the high heels, but he still endured all the pain for the sake of his sister. It was her that he remembered in his head, recalling her simple dress, long red hair, and the smile that she gave him when she was free, which made the guy want to cry now, but he wanted to save her even more. With these thoughts, he went out into the street with a tray, after which he saw on his way a servant who stood near the building and guarded everything around, and the mercenary looked at him and already wanted to clarify the right way. Coming closer, which is why the servant paid attention to the cute maid, the lady asked him where exactly she could find Mrs. Yun to give her the decoction, but Rika had no idea how the butler would react. The first thing he wanted to do was scold the maid for addressing him without his name, telling her angrily that he should be called Kacher before asking anything. However, as soon as he saw the incredible, sweet lady with bright hair and long eyelashes in front of him, Kacher immediately fell silent, and she herself told him that she was new here, so she apologized for everything. He couldn't take his eyes off Rika, not realizing that she was actually a guy, and that's why he perceived her as a real beauty, whom he was seeing so close for the first time, and who came up to him herself in order to talk. And while Kacher was falling in love with the guy, and the hired killer himself was carrying a tray with a decoction to the main character, Result was sitting with his mistress on a red sofa and holding something in his hand, when the black-haired lady explained to him that her mother did not allow her to leave the house often. The lady said that her mother always treated her like a child, and that is why she could only see him during practice in the palace. But at that time, the blonde man next to her was calmly opening a white candy from a wrapper. The guy forced the girl to eat the same candy without warning or words, and she did not resist, but only wanted to taste the candy. After that, the blonde guy in front of her started smiling and asking if the candy was tasty, And when the green-haired lady cooed, he replied that he liked the cute romantic image of the candy, which reminded him of the white moon, just like her name. In response, the girl also smiled and blushed, looking at Risselt and telling him that she would definitely give birth to a healthy heir for him if that was what he wanted. The prince's surprised older brother asked the girl what she meant, to which the joyful lady replied that she had let it slip and wanted to say later that she was pregnant by him. But it seemed that Risselt did not like this news, and she was surprised that the blonde only smiled sweetly, telling her that in that case, she needed to take care of herself and go and rest already. But the lady noticed something strange in his words. He ordered his servant named Svit Risselt to take the girl to a separate room, which caused the girl to stand up in surprise, turning to the prince and asking him what was wrong and what made him refuse her. The boy continued to sit on the red sofa, telling the girl named Luna not to be stubborn, but to just follow the servant to go home and rest, and after a while he would visit her. The lady was so happy about this that she left the prince with a smile, hoping that her boyfriend would return to her. But she had no idea that the smiling Risselt had no intention of fulfilling what he had promised her. At this time, Rika had already brought a tray with the decoction to Hawk's bedroom, where Yoon was, which is why the guy and the master looked at the maid when she said that she brought what they asked for, where the trio intended to save the mercenary's sister, and Kacher, who actually really liked Rika, also volunteered to help them. While the main character and her friends were already making a plan for how she wanted to save the mercenary's sister from slavery on a farm, Eloise was at another etiquette lesson, where the teacher was explaining to the students how to attract the attention of the prince. All the noble young ladies listened to her, because they all intended to learn everything and be as interesting as possible in order to attract the attention of the prince to be the queen of the state. But Eloise was not so much worried about her classes as about the disappearance of her friend named Luna, with whom she often went to these classes, so she looked at the teacher and asked her where her friend was. Hearing that Luna was on sick leave, Eloise was upset. But behind her back, she began to hear gossip from the ladies that Luna's carriage had overturned on the way home. And people also saw her holding her stomach after falling, when there was a lot of blood under her feet. As soon as they called Luna slutty just because she was pregnant, Eloise decided to turn to the gossips and look at them menacingly, saying that they were talking too much and that she had the right to cut out their tongues for such words. They, being baronesses, did not want to quarrel with the Duchess, so they became quiet, apologizing for their behavior and moving away from the heroine, explaining that they did not know at all that she was friends with Luna. They lowered their heads in shame and said that they would never say such a thing again, and that they were asking her to forgive them for their rudeness and impoliteness. But Eloise was just about to turn her back on them, warning in a menacing voice that there would be no next time, so they must watch what they said carefully. Eloise decided to visit her friend and soon found herself in front of Luna's mother, who said that her daughter was not feeling well, but she was very glad that Eliza had come to visit her. The purple-haired lady was surprised by the fact that, according to her mother, Luna had lost a lot of weight, and therefore it would be good if Eloise made her eat. Only because of these words, the Duchess began to worry more. Then Eloise immediately found herself in her friend's room, where she stopped in front of the red bed, telling Luna that she came to support her and to visit. But the girl herself in the bed did not open the canopy. And as soon as the regent looked at the moon, she saw her big and pale friend, who was lying in bed and did not move at all, and her eyes were empty and very dark. Struck by such a picture, Eloise covered her mouth in surprise, looking at her friend's pale, almost white face and telling her that she looked almost like a dead person, which is why she asked what happened to her. After the maid left the room, Eloise told Luna that they could talk in private and also told her in front of her that she was very worried about her and therefore wanted to know what happened. When the grief-stricken Luna whispered helplessly that her child was no more, Eloise took her friend's hand and sadly said that the most important thing now was her health, and she would be able to give birth to a child later. The girl sold her friend her hand, telling her that she was her only friend, to whom she wanted to bring her favorite snacks, work with her with spiritual stones, and also for her sake she found a gold mine. But the green-haired lady covered her tear-stained eyes with her wrist, telling her that the second prince never came to her, and now she would not be able to have children at all. Hearing this, the shocked Eloise froze, listening from Luna that Risselt promised to come to her, but never did, which is why she now thinks that he blames her for the loss of his child. After some time, the main character, along with Hawk, Rika, and others, was already in the Night Throat to carry out their plan to save the assassin's sister, which they had discussed earlier. Yoon looked at the city and told Hawk, who was standing next to her, that everything should go according to their plan and no one should be noticed, much less exposed, because they had carefully disguised themselves before this. Katcher was also forced to dress up as a woman, and Rika was standing next to her when they both told Yoon that they understood the whole plan and were ready to carry it out. But Katcher thought that his costume was ugly, unlike Rika's. So when the guy who was actually following the heroes on the prince's orders looked at Riku and wanted to address her because he noticed something strange about her behavior. But Rika began to look even more strange and suspicious in Katcher's eyes, because she smiled at him and asked if he was missing something, smiling at him so falsely that the guy got scared. He looked at the lady with fear, not understanding whether Rika was angry with him because of something, or specifically because he began to look at her often and give signs of attention. At that time, Yoon looked at the map, and thanks to it, she understood the location of the basement in the farm where the slave was. But she worriedly asked everyone why there were 10 guards there, and only one of them owned magic, which was not safe for them. Katcher, in the role of a woman, told the heroine, gesturing with his hand, that this was all because of the knowledge of mana, and the surprised heroine wanted to turn to him and ask what it was, which made the guy surprised, not understanding how Yoon had not heard this before. Having imagined the silhouette of a little boy in his head, the guy said that for mana, you need to find a spiritual stone, and then perform the awakening ritual before the age of 12 in the presence of a spiritual magician. Imagining the magician touching the boy's forehead with his finger, Katcher added to his story that this is why it is impossible for most ordinary people to awaken their abilities, and it is enough to have one person on the slave farm who possesses magic. Hak and Yoon listened to Katcher, who looked at the lady and said that of course there are exceptions, because there are those who are gifted with abilities and can awaken magic in themselves on their own. Pointing to the tall Hak in black robes, Katcher just said that this is exactly what happened to this guy, thanks to which he has magic and no one else is needed. At that moment, darkness seemed to set in among the main character, because with the map in her hand, she realized that in this world, the slave system and magic that makes others stronger began to decide Vasya. And it was these thoughts that made her draw the blade of her bright red mencha, ordering everyone to begin their actions, without killing anyone or making noise so that they would not attract too much attention. After that, she went along with Hak along the road, telling him that Rika and Katcher should wait for a convenient moment before entering the basement itself, where the slaves are located. And after a while, Yoon and Hak were already executing the plan, because they were distracting the guards, and therefore they were running down the street talking about how the guards were even weaker than they initially thought, because they only had clubs with them. Meanwhile, Rika and Katcher were able to successfully penetrate into the basement itself, when the guy in the guise of a girl held a torch in his hand, and the hired killer, also playing a maid, went down ahead of him. Sometimes he turned to Katcher and said, addressing himself as a girl, that according to the carriages, there should be a prison ahead of them and a lot of slaves, whom they had come to free. The hired killer remembered his sister named Lika and how she laughed next to him when she was little, because he wanted to see her as soon as possible, at least alive and well. Katcher used the torch to illuminate everything around him and therefore waved it in different directions. But for now, he saw only the cold walls of the dungeon, which only resembled a basement, but did not indicate that there could be slaves here. But soon they found what they came for, because right in front of them, they both saw a cell with an incredibly large number of girls who did not raise their heads and were dressed in the simplest clothes, were in dirt and dust. They were so tired and exhausted that even when they saw Katcher and Riku in front of them, they did not attach much importance to it, because they thought that they were slave owners who would starve them again. Katcher, in the role of a girl, covered his mouth with his hand, not understanding how long the people in the cell had not washed, which is why the basement stunk so much. And the hired killer, meanwhile, was looking for his sister among the many slaves. His face turned pale from shock when he saw the terrible picture before him. But what terrified him even more was that among such a large number of slaves he might find Lika, or he might not be able to. That's why he rushed to the bars to quickly examine all the women and find his sister among them, which was noticed by Katcher, who looked at his supposed partner in amazement. Even without paying attention to Katcher's words that there might be some kind of disease here because of the terrible stench, Rika grabbed the bars and started screaming, calling Lika her own sister to her. But she never showed up. She managed to get into the cell, which made all the slaves look at her in surprise. But he ran his eyes over each one and could not find a loved one among the women, which frightened her even more. Also, Rika, leaning forward, began to ask each slave if they knew a girl named Lika, who was currently 13 years old. But everyone was silent and only said that this was not the kind of place where people usually lingered for a long time. Looking at her partner in shock, Rika realized that judging by the girl's stories, this was not a place for slaves. Because the guards here were of noble origin, and they did not know that the future fate of these women was slavery. Kacher, who was holding a torch in his hand and looked like a lady, looked at Riku in the same way. But he only understood that most likely they would not find Lika here, if the ladies themselves told them that they would not stay here for long. They both stopped because a sad and devastated Rika told Kacher that Lika was definitely not here, and they should go back and look for her somewhere else. And while Kacher and the hired killer were disappointed that Liku were not ours, Hawk and the main character were also in a dark place, where only a torch was shining on the wall, illuminating the black corridors and black bars. Yoon made every opponent fall to the floor and lose consciousness with one blow, so that she wouldn't have any problems with the murders in the future. There were already 8 guys she had defeated lying on the floor, but none of them had magical mana, as Haku said, holding 2 red swords in her hands. Looking at all the commoners she had made lose consciousness and fall to the floor, the girl did not understand why there were no signals from Kasher and Rika, and whether it was because they had not found their sister. But when she told Haku to find the 2 remaining guards in order to finish them off, the lady had no idea that there was not just a cage on her head, but an extraordinary person with magical abilities in it. It turned out to be a boy with snow-white hair, a tail, and big ears, who called Hawk and Yoon brother and sister, begging them to free him from the cage, after which he would serve them for eternity. Noticing that the white-haired boy had ears on his head, Yoon was surprised, as she had never seen such guys before. And because of this, she asked Hawk what kind of creature was in the cage above their heads. Hawk looked at the boy in the cage in the same stunned way, telling the lady that it was a werewolf. But this was the first time he saw one like this, which was very rare and unusual. Imagining the host wanting to sell a werewolf to rich viewers at an auction, Hawk told Yoon that werewolves are usually bought by rich people, and that werewolves like him are very expensive, but they treat him like a pet. Looking at the snow-white appearance of the werewolf in the cage, the couple realized that he was truly incredibly expensive and valuable. Yoon was telling Haku next to her that she couldn't imagine how a child could be sold as a pet, because right in front of her she saw a little werewolf who had already been sent into slavery, but she still took her red sword in her hands, which glowed even brighter, because she was preparing to swing it in front of the werewolf's cage so that the shock wave would destroy it and the boy could get out. Hawk wanted to ask the lady what she intended to do, but it was too late, because the lady had already swung the red blade of the sword as hard and as wide as possible, causing a bright red beam to appear. And the beam itself could not touch the werewolf in the cage, but only flew in front of him. But this also made the boy afraid and move his hand away from the bars. As the main character said, with one blow she managed to open the cage even without any key, thanks to which she was able to examine the werewolf, who did not want to go down because he was afraid. Hack at this time managed to tell the lady that she shouldn't trust werewolves, because as he knows, they can be insidious and aggressive. But it seems that the white-haired boy himself had not only a beautiful appearance, but also an innocent character. However, Yoon still told Haku that she wanted to lend the werewolf a helping hand, even though she knew rumors of their evil nature, which she did, telling the boy to jump so she could catch him easily. And the boy trusted the main character, which is why he jumped from the cage straight into her hands, and Yoon managed to catch him without any injuries or mutilations. Raising his face to the lady, the white-haired boy with a large mustache looked happily at Yoon and said that he hadn't hit himself at all, which the protagonist was happy about, saying that it was very good. Looking at the heroine with his large, green, and at the same time golden eyes, the werewolf thanked the girl for saving him with such joy that he showed his small fangs because of his smile. But the heroine did not expect at all that immediately after the words of gratitude, the boy bit her on the shoulder so hard that the wound would start to bleed, and the boy himself would drink her blood with pleasure. After that, he immediately began to run away from them, while Hawk anxiously ran to the heroine and began to ask how the miss was feeling. But Yoon did not answer. She felt incredible pain in her shoulder. And the werewolf himself at this time laughed out loud, smiling at Yoon and telling her that she herself was a real, stupid woman, whom he asked not to even think about the fact that he would thank her. Having said this, the boy shouted to everyone that they would meet again, after which he ran to the end of the corridor, realizing that they would not even be able to catch up with him, because his attack was as sudden and fast as possible. Hawk did not try to catch up with the fleeing werewolf, but immediately ran up to the heroine, grabbed her by the shoulder, and began asking about her health, while Yoon herself covered the wound with her hand and was surprised that the little boy was biting like a fox. They had absolutely no first aid kits or medicines at hand, so Hack decided to heal the girl with his magic, causing his hand to create a charm circle with symbols. But suddenly the girl ordered him not to waste magic. And Hawk listened to her when Yun explained that he needed to spend magic only on the most important events so that they could get out of even the most difficult situation, and they would treat the wound later. The girl was also angry that no signals had been received from Rika and Kutcher, which is why the plan is already going wrong. But Yoon realizes that this could be due to the absence of Lika, whom they were so desperately trying to save. Feeling that her consciousness was gradually fading and becoming cloudier, the girl realized that she felt weak. But Hack quickly brought her to her senses, picked her up in his arms, and explained that due to the werewolf bite, she might pass out for a while. The calm girl thanked the guy for his help, while the guy with dark skin and a scar on his face said that now it would be best to find Riku and Kachur to unite and figure out what to do next. And while the couple was already intending to look for Rika with Kachur, two guys, only playing girls, were in the dungeon. Because the red-haired Rika was in front of one slave, who was shouting that everything was fine with her sister. She had never been sick, and she was in good health. But out of anger, Rika grabbed one girl by the collar, ordering her not to say stupid things because he was sure she was lying. But Kachur continued to tell Rika to calm down and not touch the slave. However, when Rika heard from one of the slaves that it seemed like her sister was thrown out like a dog when she got sick, the red-haired llama, who was actually a guy, realized in shock that Lika was definitely not there. In defeat, she began to groan, asking the slave where they throw out unwanted slaves, to which she replied that she did not know because all the sick girls from this dungeon were taken away by the guards. And while Rika understood that her sister was definitely not here, the werewolf with snow-white hair and ears continued to run with a sly smile because he was glad that his fangs worked. He ran, thinking to himself that he would never trust the words of that woman with a long tail. And also, in 2 days of imprisonment, he was still unable to find traces of his sister in this dungeon. But suddenly, he couldn't even move because his body suddenly became heavy and uncontrollable, causing him to grab his throat and with shock on his face try to understand what was happening to him. The guy briefly remembered the appearance of the girl he had bitten earlier, seeming to guess that he was feeling all this because of the blood of that abnormal woman. However, when he tried to understand what was happening to him, he did not expect that his palm would be pierced through by a sharp spear, causing blood to flow from his hand like a river. Two guards immediately appeared in front of the werewolf, ran up to the escaped boy, and used their own spear to force him to stop running, shouting to each other that one of the prisoners had decided to escape. The two guys started laughing at the werewolf and saying that he was the Count's property, and therefore they had no right to let him escape. And now they would even bring a new cage so that the boy would be locked up again. They also talked about how such a boy could get out of the cage, and while the werewolf himself seemed to be planning something serious, the guards said that it didn't matter, because now they needed to greet the Count with dignity. And they did not expect at all that the werewolf would not give up, but with his incredible strength would pierce the body of one of the guards with his hand, shouting at them to all die quickly, like dogs. With exactly the same force, he pulled his hand out of the guard's body, which caused even more bloodshed. And the werewolf himself told the guard that he was not a pet, so that they could humiliate him and the entire werewolf race. With his face covered in blood, the snow-white werewolf turned his head towards the still-living but stunned guard and calmly told him that humans were very pathetic creatures who should die. But this only made the guard even more angry. So he gritted his teeth and asked the werewolf how he dared to kill someone here, like a true monster who had no conscience, no regrets, and no manners. Therefore, the guy began to create a magical green ball in his hands for attack, shouting at the werewolf so that he would not consider himself the Count's most precious toy, because he was just a commodity, albeit a luxurious one for aristocrats. However, the snow-white werewolf also accumulated red and glowing magical power in his hand, asking the enemy with a smile how he could talk to him like that if he only had the 4th level of charms. And while the shocked guard realized that it seemed that his strength was several times weaker than his opponent, the white-haired boy had already rushed at him with a crazy smile, because now he incredibly wanted to quickly deal with the one he hated with all his soul. He leaned back in fear, and that saved him, because the werewolf missed and hit not him, but the wall, which cracked and crumbled with a roar, which frightened the guard even more. He understood that the beast in front of him was several times stronger, but the guard did not want to give up, so he decided to swing his poisonous magic at him, asking the boy how he dared raise his hand against a person when he himself was just a pet. But even this blow was dodged by the agile and fast beast, which is why he looked at his opponent with madness and fury, asking him if he thought he should die like a wild animal, as if that was what made him angry. Shouting out that he was wrong in everything he said, the werewolf grabbed his opponent by the head and slammed his face into the stone floor with all his might, causing not just cracks but dents to form under the guard's head. Meanwhile, Rika and Kacher, as women, were also in the dungeon and were talking about how they needed to meet Yun and Hawk first, not suspecting that a battle between a werewolf and a human was going on next to them. Kacher, who possessed magic, created a magic ball above his palm, explaining to Rika that thanks to his magic, Hawk would be able to sense their presence and find them by their enchanting aura. However, they were unable to calmly summon magic because a huge stone began to fall on them from above, which they had to quickly dodge, which Kacher shouted to everyone present. All the girls moved away from the stones, which fell with incredible force and deformed the floor. And right in front of them, something fell that clearly had colossal power. The fact is that the red-haired Rika was the first to notice the presence of an unusual man with snow-white hair, who fell from the ceiling, destroying the upper floor. Also, all the ladies present noticed in the fog that the guy with the ears was holding the head of the guard, whom he attacked. But what surprised them most was the werewolf himself. That was why Rika looked at the werewolf with shock on her face, not understanding where he could have come from in such a place, who was now beating the guard as if he wanted to kill him as soon as possible because of his enormous hatred. Preparing a second attack with his spells in order to finally kill the guard, the werewolf, mad with rage, looked at his victim with his crazy eyes and said that now she would go to heaven. However, he never managed to accomplish what he had planned, because just as suddenly as he appeared in the basement, magical purple chains flew at him, which immediately stopped the chaos and disorder. They tied the werewolf up so tightly that he began to wave his arms, trying to get rid of them. But they were not made of simple steel, but of magic, which did not allow him to even move on his own. The owner of this chain turned out to be Count Psycho, who controlled his clots of mania with his hand. Looking at the werewolf when I laughed with him was his magician, and telling him that this time his favorite toy, which he hunted for so diligently, would not be able to escape. Kacher looked at the Count in amazement, and began to wonder why such an aristocrat was here and what was going on. But all he understood was that their palanquin had definitely gotten out of control. The werewolf couldn't even move, which helped the guard get to his feet and look at the Count in shock, calling him sir and asking with fear on his face what he was doing here, as if his arrival was the most terrible thing he could imagine. But he simply walked up to the werewolf and picked him up with one hand like a cat, telling everyone from the shadows that he couldn't let his beloved pet escape, and so he came here to settle the conflict. Immediately falling to his knees before his master, the guard began to justify himself, saying that he was not guilty of anything and that it was just a series of accidents, because unknown persons had entered the dungeon and created chaos. After telling the servant that he hated people like him, the Count, with one decision, caused the guard to die, causing a lot of blood to flow from his body. And after the unfortunate guard's head was separated from his body, it fell lifelessly to the floor, with his eyes still open, and the pool of blood beneath him only grew larger and larger. Having dealt with the one who had failed to fulfill his duties, the Count ordered his magician to bring pliers, because he had grabbed the werewolf by the collar and was already intending to punish him for the noise in the dungeon and the escape. Telling the boy that his fangs had grown too fast, the Count grabbed the werewolf by the face as he begged his master not to hurt him, but the old man did not hear him, because he wanted to cause harm more and more. That's why he took the pliers in his hands and began to pull out the werewolf's fang without any fear or hesitation, which is why blood gradually began to appear in the boy's mouth. The werewolf screamed in pain and told the master to stop tormenting him, but the Count only continued to pull out the boy's fangs with a smile on his face, as if this was exactly what his pet deserved. After the Count removed the fang from the werewolf's mouth and released him, he hung his head weakly, while blood dripped from his face. And the Count told him that his fang, like that of other werewolves, would grow back with age, so there was no need to worry. So the Count ordered his faithful servant in a blue cape to kill everyone on this slave farm because an epidemic had developed there, to which the subordinate replied that he would do as he was ordered. Hearing this, all the slaves became so agitated and panicked that they began to run away in all directions, not understanding how they could save themselves, since some of them were still healthy. But even their Count ordered them to be killed like a flock of sheep. The first to object to the Count was Rika, who was about to shout the most offensive words in the world at the gentleman, but her mouth was immediately covered by Kacher in the form of a girl, who said with shock that they had better remain silent because they could reveal themselves. Katcher also shouted at Rika to find Yoon and Hak right now so that they could make important decisions later and not give in to emotions, because the whole situation was not going according to plan anyway. However, the mage of the Count had already begun to carry out the order of his master, and therefore he swung at one simple slave, who fell to the floor in fear. But this did not stop the guy, because he was already preparing his deadly magic for her. The girl screamed that she didn't want to die and therefore asked to spare the magician if he had a kind heart. But he seemed not to hear everything around him, because he was already raising his hand in order to hit the girl with his purple beam. And he did what the Count ordered him to do, not even intending to think about whether it was right, because his violet-white beam seemed to be able to cut through the air with its blinding light. But for Ma, not everything turned out to be so simple, because his magic immediately evaporated and disappeared because of one red sword, which pierced the stone between the girl and him with a ringing sound, which made the slave look at him in shock. And Rika and Katcher noticed the red sword, with shock on their faces, realizing that Yoon was somewhere nearby. If her sword immediately made the magician stop and everyone look at the owner of the sword, who liked the chaos the least. Everyone present noticed not only the angry Yoon, ready to kill everyone for the injustice, but also her loyal bodyguard Hak, who was wiping the dust from his face and telling the lady that she had thrown the sword correctly, preventing the magical attack. With her madness from the rage and anger accumulated in her soul, she looked at everyone and asked what they thought of human life if they allowed themselves to kill innocents as if they were the main sinners of the world. And the first person the lady saw among the crowd of people was the same Count who at the very beginning tried to touch her with his dirty hands, while looking at her as if she were prey. The Count himself remembered very well that lady who possessed incredible strength, who was able to leave the arena, defeating the opponent and jumping onto the fence right in front of him, which made him scared. But even more, he remembered that she called him a pathetic piece of trash at that moment. While the Count was indignant, asking if she was the prince's beloved, Yoon looked at him with a grin and honestly said that she didn't think that they would meet so soon, and in a larger company. That's why he looked at her in surprise and understood that it seemed like getting involved with her was a bad idea. But he also had a huge desire to take revenge on the heroine for all the rudeness she had caused him. And the werewolf himself could not move because of the magic chain, which is why he had to silently endure the pain in his mouth and listen to the Count's words, saying that the werewolf was his toy, and even if she was the prince's beloved, Yoon had no right to prevent him from disposing of people. Now the blonde-haired Count calmly looked at Yoon and told her that she had nothing to do with it, because she too was only the prince's toy, and not his real woman, whom he was capable of loving. As soon as he said something rude, Hak immediately stood up for Yoon and took a step forward, sternly telling his opponent to watch his language, because otherwise he would teach him how to speak to a girl correctly. But suddenly he looked at his mistress, who calmly told everyone accompanying him that the Count was right, because she really had no right to forbid him from disposing of the slaves. However, immediately after this, she began to look at the Count with her maddened eyes, and ask him what significance this had if she understood that he was a non-entity who deserved the most severe punishment. Shocked Katcher, in the role of the girl, looked at his partner with incredible shock, which Rika did too, because it meant that Yoon did not want to leave the Count alone at all. The girls were no less surprised by this, and were shocked that a crazy madam, who had a red sword and the status of the prince's lover, began to stand up for them. But the Count was already fed up with all this, and then he became even more angry, gritting his teeth and thinking that the woman in front of him clearly did not see any boundaries, and therefore he could put her in her place if Yoon was so impudent and ill-mannered. Glancing at her angrily, Giprov said that she was the only woman in his life who allowed herself to talk to men like that and help him. He was not surprised that she did not understand why he killed slaves. But the main character was not at all frightened by the Count's words, so she slowly walked towards him, holding her red sword in her hand and about to take up the second one, asking him what she should pay him for. The lady explained that the lives of slaves had nothing to do with it, because their lives were just as valuable as the lives of the Counts. And it was with these words that she approached her sword and the girl, who was so frightened that she could not get to her feet. Taking her katana in her hand, the girl looked intently at the slave and loudly told everyone that slaves were exactly the same people as she was, who deserved the best, and not a dark basement, dust and death from hunger. And while the Count laughed at her words as if Yoon had told him a joke, the slave looked at the protagonist with tired and frightened eyes, which looked even sadder against the backdrop of the girl's thin face and dirty clothes. The laughing old man in the expensive suit admitted that her words were the funniest of all that he had ever heard, because he had long ago realized that in this world the strongest survives, and truth does not exist. It is simply invented by man. Gracefully raising his hands up, the old man began to loudly say that if all these slaves were not killed, they would spread an epidemic, and it was also unknown where they would go and what they would do when they were free. Therefore, he was even doing a good deed, as he himself believed. However, when he raised his hands up again, he proclaimed that due to his kind heart, he would still order the servants not to kill the slaves, and he also proclaimed that from now on they were all free, although he did this only so that he would not get into trouble with Yoon and the prince later. All the girls fell silent and lowered their heads, as if they did not believe the words of such a terrible person as the Count, who had made them suffer all their lives and now suddenly said something about their freedom. But some of them quickly realized that if they begged the Count to spare their lives, perhaps the Lord would listen to them and have mercy, because Yoon was also able to convince him. That is why they fell on their knees before him and began to loudly ask the Count to help them survive and grant them life in exchange for the fact that they would work for him forever as faithfully as dogs. But for the master, this was just fun. One girl with purple, dirty hair even said with fear that if some people hadn't burst in here and angered the Count, everything would have been fine, and they would have just gone to their work. Like before, as if blaming Yoon for this. The protagonist herself noticed that absolutely all the slaves began to beg the Count to give them life and leave them alone, saying that it was Yoon who made the noise here, and they do not support her because she is to blame for everything, and they are ready to follow him. As angrily as before, the Count looked at Yoon and asked her if she saw that the slaves remained slaves who wanted to be subordinates and do his work even if he offered them freedom. Out of rage, he raised his hand, in which he held the magic chain, and because of which he froze the werewolf to raise his head, shouting to everyone that it was he who gave them life, and therefore everyone should be grateful to him for food and a roof over their heads. But this only angered Yoon even more, who declared that it was all wrong from the very beginning because all people are independent and have the right to freedom, and he simply convinced the slaves that the only way to survive was to become subordinates. Telling the Count not to make her laugh, the girl, in a fit of mad rage, said that he had deprived them of their dignity and forced them to be slaves in order to successfully use them, and now he calls all his machinations salvation. The red-haired Rika also thought about this and told Kacher, who was standing next to her, that if it weren't for the nobles, her sister would be alive, but now she can't even understand where she is, which scares him to death. Tears welled up on her face, and she muttered through her teeth in rage that all the problems came precisely because of the aristocrats who allowed themselves everything. And at that time, Kacher looked at her in surprise and understood the pain her partner was feeling. However, the Count still continued to talk to Yoon and prove that he was right, saying that if she was the prince's famous and adored woman, why did he allow her to come to such a dirty place? Gesturing with his hands and smiling, the Count said that it would be very good if the prince's new woman accidentally entered this dungeon for slaves while returning to the palace and was beaten to death here. And the slaves were horrified by the Count's words, because he said that it was very good to kill not only the prince's beloved here, but also to deal with the slaves who supposedly wanted to harm Yoon. Showing everyone a satisfied smile, the bald-headed Count said that this scenario suited him very well, and therefore he would stick to it, even if it required killing everyone who is currently in the dungeon with him. But in response, the heroine only said with crazy emotions that this scenario also suits her very well, because in this case, absolutely no one will be able to guess that he and his magicians died here. That's why the girl was already holding 2 red swords in her hands, preparing for battle when the Count already ordered a crowd of his magicians to attack the heroine and her bodyguard, shouting that she wouldn't even be able to fight back. As they ran screaming at Hawk and the lady, intending to attack first, the dark-skinned boy next to Yoon leaned over to her and calmly told her not to worry, as his strength was enough to deal with them without making her get her hands dirty. He also told Yoon with a stern face that if the prince found out about what happened here, he told the girl to put all the blame on him, saying that he had gone crazy and killed all the opponents. But suddenly Yoon interrupted his words, showing him her index finger and hinting to be quieter, which surprised Hawk, but the girl herself wanted to tell him with a smile that this version of events did not suit her. After silencing the guy, she calmly walked forward without saying a word, causing Hawk to look at her in surprise and wait for the moment when Yoon would do what she had planned. Yoon wanted to shout her words with all her might, raising her sword and telling the slaves that they were not animals who had to follow the orders of the aristocrats, but those who were equal to them, and they were obliged to have freedom. Pointing the bloody blade at the Count as the main problem, the girl exclaimed that it was because of this man that they could not even choose. But she was more than sure that they knew about their imminent death. That's why she shouted to everyone to listen to her and become stronger in order to wrest freedom from the Count and never serve anyone again. What was even more frightening was that according to Yun, they all wouldn't survive if she died too, so they had to quickly decide to resist. But for now, they were all scared and trying to escape due to the excitement. There was fear and despair in their eyes, as if they were afraid just from the thought of running away, because the Count would kill them or do something even worse that would make them regret what they had done. And only that very lady, who had been sitting on the cold floor and could not get up because of fear earlier, rose to her feet and took a large stone in her hands, shouting to the other ladies that they needed to resist and achieve an independent life. At this moment, the slave girl, despite her tears, realized that she could not stand idle for long. So she was forced to fight for her freedom, because the reward for such a battle would be worthy, because it was a happy life. However, the main character could no longer be stopped, because with a mad desire to defeat the Count, she shouted to everyone to fight, even if they shed blood for their freedom. But at that moment, one slave remembered how from childhood she considered herself a weak, will-less girl, and whom rich men only looked at and told her how sweet she was that no master would buy her. She also remembers how already as an adult she knelt and worshipped some guy, who even put his foot on her and told her to lose her dignity, because she would be a slave all her life. Remembering the red-haired girl who was able to because she decided to refuse the offer to be a slave, the girl, shocked by the insight, looked around and realized that she too was a person who had a choice. But she had no idea that at that moment the very same magician who had intended to kill her from the very beginning was already swinging at her, which is why he was preparing his purple magic for her. And the main character did not allow the simple lady to be killed. She immediately waved her sword in front of the magician and forced him to retreat, also asking the slave why she still had not decided to fight. Looking at her, Yoon sternly told her that she was now calling to move in order not to die. Also, the main character asked her not to go far because she would fight with all the enemies. But for the simpleton herself, Yoon's appearance in her life was such a turning point that she continued to look at her as a god, realizing that girls can be strong and not subordinate to anyone. She watched as Yoon stood fearlessly in front of one mage and was confident that she would defeat him, while the enemy himself was already intending to use his magical powers on her, as if they would stop her. With just one swing of her sword, the girl made the magician fall to the floor and doubt his victory, because her red beam destroyed everything it was in with a roar, destroying the floor and walls of the dungeon. The magician was already afraid of the woman he was fighting, but he still stretched out his hands to attack her, while his face clearly showed emotions of fear and dread that she would be the one to take his life in disgrace. However, even a second of inattention could cost him everything, because with another magical swing of her red sword, the main character made him not only retreat, but also slip and lose his balance. And the magician hit his back hard against the wall, so much so that it itself became deformed due to his body and began to collapse even more, break into small stones and crack. Noticing this, all the girls were surprised, because for the first time they saw that a warlike woman with red swords could, with one blow, make fall the one who had ruled them for years and force them to obey. And while all the slaves were just making sure that Yoon was incredibly strong not only in body but also in spirit, the protagonist herself was shouting to her guys to help her quickly protect the girl no matter what. They all agreed to fight for their freedom, which is why the formerly weak and hopeless women grabbed stones and sticks in their hands and decided to run screaming at Mashov and the Count, intending to deal with them. And the magicians themselves did not even believe that they could overcome the crazy crowd of women, which is why they stepped aside, did not understand where to run and barked, stretching their hands forward as if telling their opponents to stop and have mercy on them. But the one who believed in his victory more than anyone else was the Count himself, who pointed his finger at the slaves and loudly ordered his magicians to attack them, but they no longer obeyed him for fear of dying. Still, some of the sorcerers began to create purple, glowing magic to fight back. But the Count grew even more angry, ordering his subordinates to deal with the mad women like pigs. However, all the Count's hopes of winning remained dreams, because one blow from Yun was enough for everything around not only to shine with red light, but also to lift the opponents up, already exhausted and wounded. The main character, who had gone crazy, shouted at everyone not to even touch the slaves, because if anyone dared to touch them with even a finger, she would kill every single one of them personally, and would not even regret it. But this made the Count even more angry. he still could not accept the fact that he had lost. Then he watched what was happening with the scam and did not believe that his plans were being ruined by some crazy madam. However, the white-haired werewolf who had been kneeling and watching this whole time seemed to be amazed as well, which was written all over his long face as he realized that Yoon held no ill will towards him. Watching as his army of mages gradually lost to the main characters, the Count, stunned, shouted at them to hurry up and make every effort to win. But he had no idea that his words would not help defeat those who were initially ready to fight for their freedom. Because the main character and her friends had already gathered together and were looking at the results of their efforts when Yoon held the sword in her hands and told the Count that they had dealt with the last mage that was. Hearing this, the Count began to shout and be indignant, saying that if the girl killed him, she would start a dispute between the second and third prince, and her lover would definitely not forgive her. And at this time, the werewolf continued to be next to him. But the Count did not expect at all that his words would not even be listened to, because a large stone flew at his head, because of which the aristocrat stopped speaking, asking everyone who dared to throw a stone at him. As it turned out, the stone was thrown at him by a slave woman who was very angry with him, and therefore spoke with anger that it would be better for him to die than to live as he was now, ruining women's lives. And Yoon was surprised that absolutely all the slaves were against the Count remaining alive because they, on the contrary, shouted all sorts of nasty things at him and continued to throw stones when she stood next to Hawk. And Kutcher also told the Count that she would let him live, even if it made things worse for the third and second princes, because a bad man like him did not deserve to live any longer. And so the embittered Hawk and Kutcher instantly pounced on the frightened Count with their magic in order to take his life with one blow. But they did not suspect that the aristocrat also had a plan of salvation, because the Count suddenly took the magical purple chain in his hands and squeezed it as hard as he could, so that the werewolf would feel pain and stand up when his opponents were about to attack him, as if the hostage would stop them. And the Count's plan worked, because suddenly the main character waved her sword in front of her colleagues, which made them quickly retreat, leaving the Count unharmed, but also with a werewolf on a chain whom he holds hostage. Yoon's actions surprised the werewolf even more, who saw her back, but in front of him the warlike woman was like an angel, from whom emanated the light of salvation and hope that he would not die, but would find his lost sister. He looked at her with wide eyes and didn't understand why Yoon suddenly decided to save him when even before that he had hurt her and said unpleasant words, showing his disrespect. Kutcher was the first to express his dissatisfaction, looked at Yoon very menacingly, and told her that there was no point in stopping them, because the Count was not with a child, but an ordinary werewolf, a demonic beast that was of no interest to either the kingdom or them. Out of anger, the main character wanted to grab Kutcher by the collar and told him that this is not a reason to despise human life, because she does not even want to hear words about the fact that a werewolf is not worthy of living. But the Count also heard Yoon's words, and he grabbed the werewolf's chain and began to tug at it specifically to show everyone his cruelty, and to say that if they did not leave him, he would kill this boy. Even the werewolf himself realized that something needed to be done, and then he extended his hand to the protagonist, telling her to save him and calling her sister, and also apologizing for everything he did to her before, promising that he would never bite her again. Yoon looked at them calmly with swords in his hands, while the Count only laughed out loud, telling the girl to do what he ordered if she wanted this werewolf, who was pathetic to him, to survive. And the first thing the Count ordered was to kneel before him and apologize, saying that she was a woman and had done very bad things to him. But this did not surprise Yoon, which could not be said about Hawk, who tried to persuade the lady not to do this. The Count continued to say that she was just a pathetic creature who should worship men, but suddenly Yoon did not attack him, but only touched Hawk's chest with her hand, walking towards the Count and hinting to everyone to be calm and not to interfere. That's why the dark-skinned guy with the scar on his face watched in surprise as the lady calmly told the Count that she would do what he asked, as if she hadn't wanted to kill him before. Falling to her knees before him, she bowed low and loudly apologized for her behavior, admitting it was rude, which made the man laugh even more, keeping the werewolf chained to him. However, when the girl even apologized to him with words, the Count stopped and looked at the woman in surprise, as if he did not expect that the heroine would seriously do this, just to save the werewolf. But a second later, he started laughing again, telling Yoon that she looked extremely pathetic and funny, which is why he called her a stupid creature, while the werewolf next to him looked at Yoon with defeat. The Count didn't think at all that Yoon was just stalling for time so that one of the slaves could find a suitable, large stone and pounce on him with it to deliver the strongest blow to his head. And the aristocrat realized very late that it was all just a trap to finally finish him off. So he depicted on his face not only shock, but also fear that his life had come to an end. Immediately after the slave managed to hit the nobleman's head with a stone, she screamed in surprise. But she did so while also looking at him with shock and the realization that it was she who killed the cruel and powerful man. And at that very moment, the main character realized that she needed to act. Then she immediately rose to her feet and was about to bare the blade of her sword to deal the decisive blow to her opponent, which would end his life. Waving her hand with all her might, the girl created a red beam that not only forced the Count to let go of the werewolf, but also to tear off his hand completely, which everyone present clearly saw. The Count, now bloodied and completely stunned, began to scream in pain and tell everyone that he could not feel his hand, while the beam continued to be near his face and cut his body. And part of his body fell to the floor and did not move anymore, emitting large splashes of blood, which made everyone understand that the Count would definitely not be able to resist them, or would even die. After that, the main character stood calmly and looked at the Count, who fell on his knees and told everyone, in shock, that she would never be able to free all the slaves and that she was acting stupidly, even ridiculously. He continued to shout, telling the protagonist that even after him, a new Count will come who will hold his place firmly. And he also shouted to everyone that there will always be slaves, because commoners are slaves for aristocrats. However, no one heard his words and did not attach much importance to them, because all the slaves began to look at each other with a smile and say that Garf was dead, which made them laugh with joy. Everyone was incredibly happy that the slaves remained alive and unharmed, having defeated the magicians and the Count. But only Yoon looked at the body of the aristocrat with the sword in his hand and could not move. The thing is that after her first murder in the world, she looked at her hands and tried to calm down, find herself, or return to reality, because she doesn't believe that she could have done it. She began to have strong hallucinations, which were mixed with memories of her past life. Because there was also a moment when she was holding a gun with shaking hands, when everything was covered in blood. The first to notice the strange behavior was Kacher, who began to look suspiciously at the main character and ask her what happened, because Yoon suddenly fell silent and did nothing else. He admitted to her that she looked very strange and not like before, even telling her that she looked like she was not killing for the first time. But he did not suspect that there was an explanation for this. And the girl thought about the guy's words, lowering her head down when everything around her seemed to disappear and become darker, because all the most terrible events from the past began to emerge in her head. The most terrible event of her life happened in a metropolis, where the sky was darkening due to the onset of evening, and the lady herself was at work at the time, because she was shouting to the attacker to let the child go and calm down. When she was 22 years old, she was already a patrol officer. And so on another day of duty, she was able to notice a killer on the street who was going to kill not only himself, but also a child. But the attacker did not want to give her the child, but held a knife to his throat, furiously shouting at the heroine that his parents had deceived him into taking his money and that he was not going to remain silent, because he was already tired of all this. The girl already had the gun in her hand, aimed at the attacker, when he complained that he had nothing to pay for the mortgage and his family had nowhere to live. And besides that, he had families, a daughter almost the same age as this boy. That's why he wanted to kill him so that his parents would feel his pain. The heroine remained serious, telling the guy that a child would not solve anything in adult matters, and therefore he needed to let him go and talk in a calm environment. The gun's sight was already aimed at the man in order to shoot at the right moment, while the heroine asked the killer to let the child go. But suddenly, the furious man made a sharp movement with his hand, which makes the boy cry and beg the protagonist to save him, while the attacker continued to talk about his debts and the money that is owed to him. The shocked protagonist began to get even more worried, shouting at the criminal to immediately release the child. Otherwise, she will have no choice but to shoot him, which is her duty. But the question of whether she would be able to kill someone at all worried the girl so much that her hands shook when she realized that she had to shoot the person and take his life, because this was her job. However, when she was thinking and could not decide, the criminal made a choice instead of her, helping that, due to the quick movement of his hand, the knife in his hand became bloody, because the criminal took the life of a child. It was then that the girl realized that she also needed to act, which is why she fired a pistol with fear on her face, aimed at the attacker, but it was too late. The bullet passed through the attacker's head and instantly took his life, but he himself managed to do what he wanted, because the child along with him was about to fall powerlessly to the ground. Running closer to them, the main character realized that because of her excitement and uncertainty, two people died at once, who were now lying on the ground in a pool of blood, making the girl even more nervous. She was more amazed that she could not save the child, and she seemed not to believe in it, although she looked at him with shock, hoping that the ambulance would help him and save his life. She fell to her knees before him and could not hold back her tears, mourning his death, but still intending to help him, as if an ambulance would save him from a fatal stab wound. But she watched with defeat as the boy's blood did not stop, but continued to flow, which further reduced the baby's chances of survival, who was already in a hopeless situation. Even in the hospital, they couldn't help the boy, after which the heroine found herself alone in a dark world where everyone around her was discussing her actions, because on television they were talking about the incident in which the police had to shoot the attacker. When the girl learned that soon the mother could not cope with the loss of her child and jumped from the roof of a high-rise building, Yoon grabbed her head in horror because she realized that her thoughts had ruined 3 lives at once. She imagined in her head that if she had shot that time, she could happily comfort a living boy who would be crying over what happened. But these were just Yoon's dreams. And also in her ideal dreams, she imagined that the attacker himself remained alive, and she did not have to kill him, because he was quickly arrested by the police. But the reality turned out to be more terrible than any nightmare, and she was forced to come to her senses by the werewolf, who had been next to her until then and was touching her clothes, intending to thank her for saving her. But in him, the lady saw exactly the boy she had failed to save in her past life. He told her in a trembling voice that he had just been killed and that this thought made him very scared. But he was extremely grateful to her for not giving in to panic in a stressful situation and saving everyone. Surprised, Yoon looked at the werewolf and seemed unable to believe that everything that had happened was real, because the boy in front of her was almost crying and thanking her for saving him, just like in her dreams, where she had managed to save the child. The werewolf in front of her told her that this count was a very influential person, so he asked her if she felt sorry for him and if she regretted taking his life. And suddenly the girl knelt down in front of the werewolf and put her hands on his shoulders, looking into his eyes and saying that she did not regret what she had done at all, because all people were equal, including she and him, the count and the king. The black-haired lady calmly looked at the werewolf and told him that everyone was equally equal, even if before that the boy had bitten her on the shoulder and deceived her, assuming that the heroine was just another stupid woman. And the girl's words surprised the boy so much that he looked at her in shock and could not find the words, because now he realized that all this time he was wrong. And among people, there are kind, sincere people who are ready to help. The girl also said that she simply made her choice, looking at the boy. But the werewolf was surprised, asking what she meant because he did not know that the girl had a tragic memory from a past life. Imagining a golden scale in her head, the girl told the little girl that no matter how serious the sin, a person must appear before the court and be punished according to the law. Also imagining the chairman's hammer, Yoon continued to say that in a world where there is no law that calls a sin, she decided to do just that, killing the count for the safety of him and the girls, which she did thanks to her conscience. That's why she looked at the werewolf with confidence and said that even if she had to kill a person several times, she would still do it if it was necessary for the safety of the defenseless and people like him. Hearing this, the happy werewolf decided to pounce on the girl with hugs, which surprised Yun. And she also listened to his words when he said that he would be faithful to her all his life, and he was grateful to her for deciding to save him. However, when he hugged her, he still did not smile, but looked away, because he felt that the lady was behaving strangely and had a suspicious mindset that he could not understand, but he was still grateful to her for saving her. While the werewolf was only sure that Yun would treat him the same way as the Count, 2 girls approached the protagonist and asked her what to do with the guys who remained alive. The thing is that the ladies managed to tie them up while they were unconscious, which is why the blonde is now asking Yoon what to do with them, since they are still alive, which means they can interfere with the plans. Yoon calmly replied that they all had every right to do with them whatever they saw fit if they dared to endanger their lives and rule over them as if they were animals. And the girls already wanted to resolve this issue between themselves by killing the magicians. But suddenly Rika intervened in their conversation, shouting for everyone to stop, while Kachur was nearby and seemed to understand what exactly his partner wanted. The thing is that the red-haired guy in the role of Ricky came closer to the girls and asked them to leave the magicians alive in order to ask them about his sister named Lika, who disappeared a long time ago, and he suspects that they might know where she is and what happened to her. Only after telling the girls about his missing sister did the guy remember how he had been walking down the street with her for a long time and laughing when they both held groceries in their hands and talked about a variety of topics, not suspecting that fate would separate them almost forever. The red-haired guy fleetingly remembered his mother, who was actually a very beautiful woman, had exactly the same red long hair and was like an angel, kind, sweet. But one day she became the mistress of a nobleman. Soon the couple had a cute boy and the family became a real family, which made the aristocrat very happy. So happy that he intended to give his son magical abilities. And so he himself was born, who from a young age could already summon golden clots of magic with his own hands, and all thanks to the ritual that the boy's father conducted in his very childhood. But the family's happiness was short-lived, because soon the boy's father died and the mother was forced to flee to the slums with her son, because they were persecuted by the disliked yard, which is why they ended up in the ruins. But the mother still held her son by the shoulders and said that everything would be fine. The boy admitted that his mother did not know how to raise children and could do nothing at all, which is why she soon used her beauty to be with a rich lover, a slave owner. But this time, the boy's mother was unlucky with love, because the slave owner very quickly began to beat her as if she were his slave, and all because her lover had a son. But all his mistresses bore him only daughters. Therefore, just to please the man, she decided to get pregnant, which is why she became indifferent to everything, but often said that she supposedly loved the master very much and was grateful to him for everything. Life gradually got worse because the boy's mother spent all the jewelry given to her by her lover on something unknown. And soon she gave birth to a premature, ugly girl with the same red hair, which made the slave owner even angrier. And he was so angry with his mistress that he took a brick in his hands to beat her, when the boy's mother was already weak, because she had recently suffered a difficult birth and could not walk. That day, the boy could not save his mother, because when he arrived to her, she was already just a cold body covering her daughter, fortunately alive, who was screaming and crying from hunger and cold. Her lover continued to beat her with a brick for a long time while she was in bed, covering her newborn daughter with her body. But he continued to scream that he would kill the baby too, burying her in some forest. Therefore, when the grown-up guy finally appeared in front of his mother's lover, he activated his magic in order to kill him without any emotion of regret on his face, because he considered his mother a stupid woman without dignity. Soon, all that was left of his mother's lover was a bloody corpse that no longer moved, and the boy himself was about to start a new life, raising in his arms the child that his mother had protected with her life. He decided to take his sister in his arms and leave the slums forever, because he did not want to feel the loneliness of being alone, an orphan whose father and mother had died. But before he left, he was sorting through his mother's things and then came across a wooden box that interested him. So he opened it and realized that his mother had left him a farewell letter in it. In it, the boy's mother said that she really wanted him to live better than she did, and that's why she gave him all these gold coins so that he could at least live for a while with food and a roof over his head. He realized that his mother did not give all the jewelry to her lovers, as he had previously thought, but in fact she exchanged everything for gold in order to give the savings to her son, which is why he remembered his red-haired, beloved mother. Remembering how his mother touched her hair and seemed to admire herself, the boy began to think about whether his mother knew that she would die soon if she decided to create such a box for him, which made him even sadder. Remembering that his mother wanted him to live a better life than hers, the boy walked into the unknown with a beautiful sunset behind him. But he cried as he looked at his little sister. He realized that his little sister was the most precious thing he had now. So he hugged her while tears continued to flow down his face, and he himself did not know where to go. But he felt that now they were definitely inseparable. Time passed very quickly, because of which his little sister gradually grew up to be a very happy child, who not only crawled on her little legs, but also smiled, rejoiced, and extended her hands to him, was happy. Long red hair also grew, and the girl became more and more beautiful. Happier, even though she did not see her parents. She only recognized her brother, who took care of her all this time. And when the girl began to braid her long hair, but there was still a happy smile on her face, she met her brother after work and was happy about his return, while the boy himself understood that she was the most important person for him. The guy himself was also growing, which is why he looked like a real man, looking at his little sister and telling her with a smile that he brought her a gift, because in fact he always tried to please her with surprises. Having given the girl an incredibly beautiful blue dress for her 12th birthday, the guy watched as his happy sister spun around the house, because on her birthday she got what she wanted so much. But when the guy placed his palm on the top of her head and asked what she wanted for her birthday, The red-haired girl happily replied that she would really like to become a mother, which puzzled her brother. He anxiously tried to explain to her, looking her in the face, that it was too early for her to have a child, and therefore she could rely on him, because her sister would be with him all her life and she should not rush to get married and start a family. But the happy lady in the blue dress added to her words that she only wanted to be the mother of a child who had lost his parents, which surprised her brother even more, who stood in front of her and looked at her. Raising her hand to her face, the girl said that she understood that children left without parents have no one to turn to, and they must be desperate for love, just like her brother, who once felt the same way. The girl said that she understood how hard it was for her brother, which made the red-haired guy look at her in shock, realizing that she was talking about him and already perfectly understood what kind of situation she had gotten herself into. Looking at her brother with a sweet smile, the red-haired girl said that it was for this reason that she wanted to give warmth to children like her brother who certainly needed it. In this amazing moment, the boy realized that his sister is the most precious person in his life, which is why he tells himself to look after her all his life and protect her from the evil in the world. Then, and now in the role of Ricky, he took one magician by the collar and began to shake him with anger and fury, asking where his sister was, because he was sure that they knew her final fate. And while Rika was telling the injured and tied-up attacker that she knew that he was the one transporting 6 slaves somewhere, there were already 2 girls standing behind her who seemed to know something. The common man who had previously served the count raised his head and came to his senses, but began to angrily ask Riku in front of him what he was talking about. And then the red-haired lady answered him that he was the one who should know where exactly the slaves who could no longer work were being transferred. Hearing this, even Yoon was surprised, looking at what was happening with stunned eyes, because the tied-up guy said something that made everyone stop breathing. The thing is that even Rika heard from the guard that 6 slaves are not taken away or taken anywhere, but are immediately killed and thrown into a common pit with dead bodies, a grave for all the sick. Having realized only that his beloved sister, whom he so wanted to see alive and hug, could lie dead deep in the pit, the guy in the role of the girl ran away. All this time, the gray-haired girl with a thin face sadly closed her eyes and told her friend next to her that she knew Lika, Rika's sister, before she passed away. Memories of when Kacher and Rika first entered the dungeon and the second girl began interrogating each one, holding her by the collar and asking her where her sister had gone if she was in good health, came flooding into her mind. It was her that Rika shook in front of her, ordering her to tell all the information about Lika and where she was. But the girl did not dare to tell Rika what exactly happened to Lika. And when Kacher once again held Rika and told her that a slave would not be able to speak to her in such a tone, the shocked red-haired lady let go of the girl with despair on her face, asking everyone where they could have put the healthy slave. The gray-haired lady clutched her chest and began to breathe loudly, telling everyone that she didn't know why everyone was making such a fuss over one sick slave, even though the very fact of throwing people away like animals was abnormal. But Rika still really wanted to know where exactly her younger sister was thrown out, which is why she yelled at the slave, asking her where the slave owner could have put the sick and unwanted slave. And after she said that she allegedly didn't know where exactly Lika had disappeared to and what had happened to her, a friend approached her and asked why she hadn't told Rika the truth if she knew where her younger sister had actually been taken. The gray-haired lady only looked sadly at Poe and admitted to her friend that she knew Lena and was even friends with her. But now, when she remembered her, an unpleasant feeling of sadness appeared in her soul. In her head, she remembered Lika and her smile, how she once brought her some food with the words that she had recently managed to hide an egg from the guards, so they would be able to eat deliciously. They both sat down on the grass and began to get acquainted. Or rather, Lika talked about herself and her name, saying that her brother, whom she loves very much, waits for and respects, called her that. But the lady continued to be sad. The gray-haired girl sometimes looked at her with a smile and realized that it seemed like she grew up in a loving family, if she herself was literally a ray of light that could lift anyone's spirits. And now, when the lady was next to her friend among the same other ladies, she asked her interlocutor if she could tell Rika that she once angered the guards because she cried incessantly for her brother. Sadly bowing his head forward because she began to cry, the girl said that she heard that it was because of this that Lika was beaten to death by the guards with sticks, and then carried into the burial pit. And when the girl told her friend that she was sure that Lika was no longer alive, Rika herself was already running to the large burial grounds, where the guards left the slaves to die, when the day was already approaching sunset. Even when the guy in the role of the girl fell from haste, he immediately got back on his feet and continued walking, because the desire to see his own sister was incredibly great, and he still had hope that she was alive. And behind her walked Hak and Yun, who looked at Riku, realizing that no miracle would await them at the mass grave, but only the bones of those who had previously been human. But even this did not stop Riku. The main character angrily closed her eyes and asked Hawk what kind of monster without any feelings must one be for them to now see such a terrible picture in front of them that no one would remain indifferent. The fact is that Rika, having arrived at her destination, saw before her not just land, but a plain on which were white human bones and skulls, one of which could have belonged to her beloved little Lika. However, an even greater shock for the guy in the role of a girl was that when he stood up and silently turned around, he saw on one of the bones sticking out of the ground some kind of fabric that immediately reminded him of something. The thing is that the long bone was apparently decorated with a blue ribbon with the most ordinary patterns, which had obviously been there for a very long time, because it had already managed to get dirty and deteriorate. But it was only because of this ribbon that the boy remembered his sister, who loved to tie her hair with this very blue ribbon, which she adorned herself with on her 12th birthday, the only holiday when they were together. The guy, also devastated and desperate by such a find, remembered how he stroked his younger sister's head and told her that it was too early to become a mother for a child, because she was under his care and could only marry for love. But now, the girl who sincerely wanted to give warmth to other children like her brother was no longer alive, and all that was left of her were her bones and a ruined ribbon, which Rika reached out to take. Taking the dot in his hands and pressing it to his chest, the guy burst into tears at the top of his voice, which is why the tears gradually began to flow from his eyes to his chin, because he realized that he would never be able to see his beloved, dear sister again. The guy screamed that it was because of him that Lika was killed, but Yoon confronted him and calmly said that it was not so, because she was more than sure that his sister was killed by an evil system and terrible people. Hearing such a strange word as system, the guy in the role of the girl turned to Yoon and sincerely said that before he met her, he had not even thought about it. But now he understands everything that is happening around him. Grabbing the main character by the shoulders, the guy desperately asked her why he couldn't fight back before all this, against those who did bad things not only to him, but also to his beloved sister. With tears in his eyes, he admitted that he had never even thought about breaking into the dungeon one day and saving his sister, because the system in his head was so ingrained that he obeyed everyone. His tears continued to flow down his face as he confessed to Yun that he was sincerely afraid of offending the aristocrats and the powerful count, and that he had always lacked the courage to save his sister, which was why he was now crying. Hearing this, the main character looked at Riku with surprise and defeat, because the guy himself admitted to her that he was so submissive to everyone that he could not protect the only person dear to him from evil. Already about to fall to his knees in front of Yun, the boy admitted that if it were possible to turn back time, he would have killed all the guards, even at the cost of his own life, just to save his sister. But now it was all over. But the lady did not let the guy run away, because she picked him up and hugged him, saying that he was absolutely not to blame for his sister's death, because a society where kindness and tenderness are not valued is the most terrible evil. The desperate boy looked at Yoon as she said that his sister was also not to blame for being kind to everyone, even if she ended up in slavery due to her naivety. But he was also not to blame for allowing her to be so kind in this cruel world. After that, the guy just wanted to hug the girl tighter, whispering to her with tears that he would not give up anyway, because he would take revenge for the death of his sister on everyone who was somehow involved in her innocent death and turned a blind eye to everything. But even this was not enough for the guy, because after he sincerely told the heroine that she should not be just the prince's mistress, he put his hand on her chest and with a stern look asked her to become a blade for her, so that he could help her rise to a higher income. He looked at the lady and told her that the day she gained power, he would sincerely watch as slavery died and became a thing of the past for everyone, including the arrogant aristocrats. Although the girl was shocked by the guy's harsh words, which is why she looked at him with surprise, she could not refuse such an offer due to the fact that the man decided to give himself to her in honor of the death of his own sister. So she took the guy's palms in her hands and told him that in that case they had agreed between themselves. After which, when the rays of the sunset fell on them, the red-haired guy slowly stood up. She looked at him with a smile and said that from now on she would entrust the protection of her back to him, which was a real honor for a hired killer. Meanwhile, behind the main character, a large number of girls appeared, who were also freed from the dungeon and were defeating them, calling Yoon by name. They also asked Yoon to take them with her because they incredibly want to become as strong and independent from everyone as she is. because now they have an irresistible desire not to obey anyone anymore. The gray-haired lady even put her hand on her chest and looked at Yoon resolutely, telling her that it was she who gave them strength and faith in themselves because of the heroine, and they want to be with her in order to save even more sisters in the future. This surprised the main character even more, so she looked at the ladies again with shock, also asking if they weren't afraid to follow her further, which could cost them their lives, because in this world, freedom is clearly not encouraged. The lady with the blonde hair answered honestly and calmly that she was afraid to follow her. But what would be even more frightening for her was that she would continue to obey this system and live in fear, like a rat. Yi-yoon looked at the ladies in shock because they told her that they wanted to follow her in order to live with dignity and die as a free person, and not to submit to a system that makes slaves out of them. After that, the main character smiled sweetly, which meant that she really liked the girl's idea. And she also remembered that when she appeared in this world, she just wanted to make herself free. But in the end, fate brought her together with the right people. Therefore, the ladies quickly grouped together and began to discuss future plans with Rika, while there seemed to be cleanliness and order around them, thanks to which the protagonist understood that now everything had changed and she had followers, those who believed that she was right and not crazy. So, when the rays of light fell beautifully on her face and the sunset became more and more intense, she looked at everyone with peace and confidence, informing everyone that it was time for them to return to the place where many slaves died, and they received the motivation to change the world. And after that, all the girls, led by Yoon, Hak, Kacher, and Rika, returned to the palace when the sky above it was already dark with bright stars, which made the windows glow, and there was no one on the street. The protagonist also ran to tell everyone that they still had to talk to that man who, with his power, could change a lot for the better, as well as for the worse. And she meant the prince. In the palace itself, the main character walked along the corridor, accompanied not only by the maids, but also by the werewolf, which is why all the ladies looked at him. And Yoon was saying that all the girls were distributed among the rooms, for which she thanked the maids. One of the maids decided to lean towards the werewolf and look at him with her sweet eyes, because she also considered him very charming and handsome because of his snow-white ears and lush tail. However, after the little boy hissed at the girl, causing her to run away, he began to point his finger at her and laugh, saying that she was a real fool because she was running away from him in fear, like a dog. But as soon as Yoon gave the werewolf a good slap on the head with her palm for such mischief, the boy with golden eyes turned to her and sweetly said that he would not misbehave anymore, and this was his way of apologizing to her for his bad manners. And while Yoon was raising her new friend, Kacher, in the guise of a lady, was already a petal prince and reported to him about everything that had happened, talking most of all about Yoon, calling her a crazy woman who had pushed the women to revolt. The prince, however, listened silently to Kacher's story about how in the dungeon the count asked her to kneel down and apologize for everything, but after that he was killed without any hesitation, which made the blue-eyed aristocrat think. Kacher also wanted to tell the prince that Yoon was clearly not a human if she made the decision to kill people without any hesitation. But suddenly, taking the king chess piece in his hand, the prince asked his subordinate to stop. Presenting her piece to her face, the girl sincerely and peacefully told Kacher that he did not feel disgust towards strong pawns, meaning Yoon, because he was the person who, in his own words, plays chess. All this time, Kacher looked at her master with shock, because he had previously thought that the prince would be very angry at Yoon and her actions, but he remained calm, saying that it was even better this way. The prince looked at the chessboard with a relaxed expression and said that if he entered this game, it meant that he had to control all the pieces in order to win this battle later. While the prince was talking about his beloved, speaking of her as if she were a pawn, Yoon herself was already in the bathroom, taking a hot bath and watching the chandelier, wondering whether it was made of gold and how it was made. Touching her hair, she also wondered how many slaves had been involved in creating such luxury, which made the girl think that this world was truly cruel and merciless even in such things. And at this time, she did not even suspect that behind her back a naked werewolf was already running towards her, who was without a single garment and was telling her with joy that he was running to take a bath with her. And as soon as the girl turned her head towards the werewolf to warn him that it was very slippery here, she looked at him in amazement. But thanks to this situation, she realized that the werewolf was a boy, albeit a very cute one. Like the girl that she had thought earlier, Rika immediately appeared in front of him, playing the role of a maid, and began asking the werewolf what right he had to enter the women's bathroom when he was a guy, causing the boy to get angry. showing Rika his fist and telling her that she was actually a guy too. The red-haired lady, who is actually a boy, remained calm as she asked the lady what she should do with the werewolf, causing the lady to ask her to wash the boy very thoroughly for her. And after that, the red-haired guy playing the maid immediately grabbed the werewolf by the tail and dragged him along, causing the boy himself to scratch the floor with his nails and shout for Yun to stop him and leave him with her. But it was too late. But the main character only covered her face with her palm in shame, selling being in a hot bath and thinking about what it was all about and why the guy decided that she would accept his company and happily invite him to the bathroom. At this time, the prince continued his conversation with Kacher because the servant still remained with him and asked the future ruler what they would do now that the count was dead. But the prince still looked at the chess piece in his hands with incredible calm, telling Kacher that someone from the count's house would still take care of it for them. Hearing this, Kacher was incredibly surprised, looking at his master with wide-open eyes and asking him if he had already placed his people in the count's house while he himself was dying in prison. But the prince, holding the figure in his hand, calmly asked Kacher how his beloved pet, who had been carefully guarded all this time, could suddenly, unexpectedly for everyone, escape from the carefully guarded residence. However, the mere fact that the prince had already learned that the werewolf had escaped from prison and was no longer a slave made him look at the aristocrat with admiration as he sat there. And Kacher understood that he was ready to follow and obey such a brilliant man for the rest of his life. As soon as the prince hinted to Kacher that he should change his clothes before talking to him about serious topics, the prince's servant immediately headed to the door and apologized to the nobleman for his absurdity, telling him that he would immediately put himself in order. And while Kacher did not understand from what moment he got used to wearing a long skirt and hair, the prince himself continued to sit at the table completely alone in the empty office, playing chess with himself. The prince wondered why his beloved had decided to save the slaves, because no one else had ever thought about this. But for the aristocrat, it meant a lot, including the fact that Yun was clearly striving for what he wanted. But when the prince thought of Yun, he also remembered his dead lover with a very cute appearance, blonde hair and pink hair. So at that moment, if she were alive, he would tell her that one lady had finally done what she had dreamed of all her life. That was why he was sitting on the old one and playing chess alone, because in his head he still remembered how he spent time here with his beloved blonde, having fun with her in front of the chessboard. He remembered that moment as if it were yesterday, when he took the king's piece in his hands and wanted to make his move, but the girl also extended her hand to him, and then pulled it back as if she was afraid of making a mistake in the prince's action. And she looked at how the prince placed the pieces on the board with such surprise, as if for her it was a real miracle and the most interesting game in the world, and therefore it was even more exciting for the prince to spend time with her. He smiled sincerely and continued to introduce his beloved to a complex game, which brought him only pleasure, but he had no idea that in the future he would only dream of returning to the past, because now he is sitting at the same table in the same game, but he feels only longing and emptiness inside, which is unlikely to ever be filled again, because the very lady who made him happy and was the meaning of his life is no longer alive. And after some time, when the main character had time to take a bath, put on a nightgown and lie down on the prince's bed so that everyone would believe that they were really dating, she read a book in silence. But even now, she was wondering whether she should sleep in the same bed with the prince so often, if everyone was already convinced that she was the prince's mistress, which is what she was thinking about with the red book in her hands. She would have continued reading the story, but put the book away when a prince in a dark robe appeared in front of her and asked her in a rough voice if she was tired of living, if she personally killed a rich and powerful count in the dungeon. The girl looked at him with rejection and hostility, said that her life had long been in his hands, and she also asked if he himself wanted to kill that count, because he was an obstacle to his plans. But what was her surprise when the prince suddenly grabbed her hands and hung right over her, telling her in a rough voice that she didn't need to know the rules of the game, because she was just a pawn in his hands, and not a queen. And while the stunned girl looked at him, the prince said that she also brought with her to the palace unfortunate girls, burdens, who were considered insignificant here, and therefore she must do everything he said so that they would survive. He said it as earnestly as he could, while looking into her eyes and thanks to the deep neckline, showing all the beauty of his toned body. But Yoon was not interested in this, for even when she calmly asked him if he was threatening her, the prince replied that he was. After which he took her chin in his hands and said with a smile that the day might come when she would lead the king's enemies. He also said that she was just a pathetic woman, so he recommended that she not stand out anymore and not show her character. But Yoon only smiled in response, saying that she was truly only a mistress. After this, the lady removed the gentleman's hand from her face and stood up, surprising the prince, saying that she knew perfectly well that he wanted to make her a pawn to conquer the throne, so that he could then become the king of the entire state. Holding the prince's hand in front of her, Yoon said with a smile that as long as he didn't seize the throne, it would be best for him to listen to her, so as not to cause himself more trouble. And she also warned him that she was worth trusting. The strange and self-confident woman made the prince not only shut up, but also move away from her, because even now he felt that Yoon's character was not something he could easily take advantage of. He turned away from her and got up from the bed, again began to talk about how she would not be able to seduce him, because she was far from a chaste woman. Although in fact, Yoon did not care deeply what kind of mistress the prince had and what he felt for her. Looking at her with an evil look and seemingly displeased, the prince told her to carry out all his orders and continue as an ideal pawn. Otherwise, he would kill her and would not even regret it. The next morning, Duchess Eloise appeared again before her best friend Luna, asking about her condition and informing her that she had brought a tonic for her, also asking her maid to prepare soup for her. Taking her friend by the hand, Eloise also said that they were alone again, and she really wanted to see how she was gradually getting better. And she also said with sadness that the second prince, unfortunately, had a lot of women, so he never came to her. But when the woman wanted to get out of bed, with which Eloise helped her, Luna said that she still cannot forget about the second prince, because she is sure that the prince hates her because of the loss of the child, and she is also sad because she will never be able to have children again. Hearing this, Eloise confessed that her mother had died naturally when she gave birth to her, so she thought that it was even for the best, because she could protect herself from death, and she could experience the happiness of motherhood thanks to her orphaned children. The purple-haired lady told her friend while holding her that giving birth was a terrible thing for her, but her green-haired Luna replied that now she would not be able to give birth at all, which was devastating her inside. Luna was ready to cry, telling her friend that she could only give her beloved prince her first time in virginity and nothing more. That's why she despairs. She keeps thinking that she can give it to him. Hearing this, Eloise looked at her friend with real shock, because she did not understand why, after she gave herself to the prince, she had nothing left that she could give him. And while Eloise was surprised by every word of her friend, the main character was already in a blue dress and was sitting on the sofa, showing Rika her diagram and her references, whether it would be possible to do what is on this diagram. But Rika continued to look at the paper with surprise on her face, asking the Lord what kind of diagram this was, and whether it was a cleaning tool. However, Yoon responded to her maid with a smile, holding a white feather in her hand and telling Rika that this is exactly what she says, as if she already had a plan on how to create it into reality. Because after some time, Kachar already appeared before the prince in his office in order to tell him about a certain drawing that Yoon asked to show him specifically with a request to ask the artisans to make it. Kachar also looked at the prince and explained that this was precisely for distributing to the slaves rescued from the dungeon, which made the prince even more curious about what exactly the protagonist had come up with. But when he himself picked up the paper to examine it, he did not understand anything of what was depicted on it. So he became angry and asked the servant in an indignant tone what Yoon had thought. The thing is that the paper depicted a very ordinary pistol, or rather a diagram with all possible details to make it fully functional. But the calm Kachar told the prince that, according to Yoon, it was supposedly a cleaning tool. And while the prince was seeing this firearm before him for the first time, another servant was in front of the second prince, named Risselt, to whom he announced the news that Count Flossard was dead, but it seemed that Risselt did not care, because he was in the company of another lady. A lady in a blue dress sat on his lap and was silent as Risselt stared at the servant and still asked him how it happened, because this news even upset him. Although before that, he didn't care even about his own child. The servant with short hair and in a blue suit replied that everything happened in the Count's residence, where there was a fire and there were no survivors, after which he also asked whether it was worth continuing the investigation into this matter. Remembering his third younger brother, the blonde just put his hand on the top of the brunette's head and told the servant not to continue the investigation because he no longer needed it. But he remembered exactly the one who was supposed to inherit the title of Count after his dead father, which is why Risselt asked the servant to bring this man, the son of Count Flossard, to him personally. At the same time, one of the characters had the most terrible dream, because in front of him he noticed a human hand in a dark glove in which he was holding an obviously bloody instrument. The fact is that the werewolf experienced all the most nightmarish events in his life in his sleep because it was with that very instrument that the Count's son pulled out his teeth, since it is the werewolf's fangs that are very valuable and expensive to sell. But as soon as he suddenly woke up and, out of habit, began to defend himself from the attacker, thinking that he would have to fight for his life again, he woke up and noticed a surprised Yoon in front of him, with several scratches appearing on her hand. And so the werewolf looked at Yoon with fear and surprise, keeping his hands tense and knowing that no one intended to hurt him, because Yoon just wanted to get closer to him. When the boy noticed a white blanket on the red sofa, Yoon calmly explained that she wanted to cover him with the blanket because she saw that he was shivering in his sleep, which made her think he was cold. But that was not all, because Yoon's injury was seen by the stunned maids who immediately began to panic, because they had previously thought that a werewolf was a very terrible creature, dangerous to people,